The brave man inattentive to his duty is worth little more to his country than the coward who deserts her in the hour of danger.
Those are the words of Andrew Jackson, our 7th president, and the subject of this, the 7th episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast. Welcome to episode 7 of the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
We're here with our Andrew Jackson episode. Going to be a very exciting episode.
This is going to be a pretty good one. Strap yourselves in. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
It's going to be intense.
Probably pretty painful. Pretty fierce.
A lot of bullets flying.
Bullets flying, people crying, folks are dying. Something barbaric about Andrew Jackson. Something, shall we say, animalistic in his nature.
It's interesting.
Certain sort of animal fury. His ferocity from within.
Perhaps, and that definitely plays into the top 5 we have this week.
Yes, it is a good one. As you know, Jim, the saying goes, if you want a friend in Washington, buy a dog. Many presidents have had dogs, but some have had some more exotic friends. And that's going to bring us to the top 5 presidential pets.
Number 5.
Martin Van Buren's tigers.
Yep, Martin Van Buren had some tigers. Early in his presidency, he received 2 tiger cubs as a gift from the Sultan of Oman.
Very, very interesting. What a gift.
Van Buren, he loved these tigers. He had kept them at the White House. Congress was not too happy about it. They felt that the cubs were a gift not to the president personally, but to the United States, and they wanted the tigers in the zoo, but Van Buren didn't want to give them up. He claimed that they were a gift to the president, and he wanted to keep them.
Yeah, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
He's just like, yeah, I think I'll hold on to these tigers.
Yeah, that's the classic scenario between kids and parents. Oh, can we keep him?
Yeah.
No, little Martin, it's unconstitutional. This was an epic clash.
Ach, nein, but I want to keep the tigers.
An epic showdown between 2 co-equal branches of government, putting separation of powers and checks and balances to the test. Who will win the battle of the tigers? Eventually, Congress won out, and Van Buren had to give the tigers to the zoo. But
yeah.
He loved them. I'll bet he went and visited them all the time.
I tried to look up. I couldn't find their names.
Yeah, I didn't see their names either, but
Hey, listeners, if you find the tigers' names, why don't you go ahead and hit us up in the comments section? And I just opened up a whole avenue for some serious trolling.
Yep.
Cool. But that's going to bring us around to top 5 presidential pet.
Number 4.
John Quincy Adams, alligator. In an 1825 visit to the White House, Revolutionary War hero the Marquis de Lafayette brought a gift for President John Quincy Adams, an alligator. Adams kept the alligator in the bathtub in the East Room of the White House and liked to scare visitors by leading them into the room without telling them about said alligator. Imagine strolling through the White House with President Adams, perhaps discussing his plan to charter a national university, when all of a sudden, an alligator darts across the room. You scream in terror and look over, and John Quincy Adams is laughing his tits off. Very mature behavior for a president.
Yeah. He probably runs and tells the First Lady.
Boy, did I get him good.
Secretary of State almost pooped his pants.
Yes. And the Secretary of the Navy did.
Yep. Luckily, there was a bathtub nearby for them to wash
Exactly.
up.
It was easy to wash the trousers out. Very interesting pets thus far. Quite exotic.
Yeah.
But it's only going to get more crazy because we're coming around to top 5 presidential pet.
Number 3.
Thomas Jefferson's grizzly bears.
Was the year 1807. Zebulon Pike led an expedition to explore the western United States. That's where we get Pike's Peak.
Exactly.
He sent back to President Jefferson a gift of 2 grizzly bear cubs. So far, these exotic pets, all gifts.
All gifts. And
President's not necessarily sitting around thinking, you know what, I need 2 grizzly bears.
No, I feel like this is kind of a little bit inappropriate on the part of the gifter. This is like, oh, what can I get the President of the United States? Oh, I know. 2 tigers. Oh, I know. An alligator. Oh, I know. How about some grizzly bear cubs?
Well, they wanted to show off their exotic animals, I guess, in Oman, and Zebulon Pike, discovering the territory of the grizzly bears, really, for the United States.
Yeah.
And, this is a different species of bear that's not known.
Just seems like what would be, to me, in my mind, a knowingly impractical gift. Yeah. Like, you're gifting somebody something that you know is going to inconvenience them.
Yeah.
Who's going to clean up the tiger poop?
Mm-hmm.
Not Van Buren with his bathing every day lifestyle. Yeah. What?
And then Jefferson gets 2 grizzly cubs. It's like, how long can he keep these before they become a physical danger to the president?
Correct.
In the days before the Secret Service.
Yeah.
Grizzly bears, known as the most ferocious animals on the continent at the time, the cubs arrived at the White House, were kept in an enclosure on the White House lawn. Some passersby liked to see the grizzlies. Others made cracks about the White House bear garden.
Oh, yeah.
Referencing the sport
beer gardens of Germany.
Of bear baiting.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I was thinking they were making a joke on beer gardens.
No, that's the old bear baiting arena.
Oh.
Maybe if Andrew Jackson had some grizzlies, he might engage in some bear baiting, gambling.
That's where they would just it was like nobles and shit would just basically.
Yeah, they'd have a bear
have shit with no chance,
and then dogs would attack it, I think.
Yeah. Wow. What a scummy thing.
That's what Jefferson could have been doing, but if he wanted, but he didn't do that. He quickly.
So just for our listeners, just to let you know, if you didn't know, I didn't know what bear baiting was, it's a disgusting practice.
Yeah, I don't think it was even current at the time anymore.
I think I might have been early on the beer gardens thing, too. That might have been a little bit later in Deutschland.
Yeah. Well, Jefferson soon found that his bears were too dangerous and troublesome to keep at the White House. He donated them to Charles Wilson Peale's museum in Philadelphia. Peale was happy to have them. He obtained a large cage for them. He wanted to study the species as it grew to full size, hoped they would breed. However, as the bears grew up, they became more and more aggressive. One of them broke out of its cage and rampaged through the museum, threatening Peale's family, and had to be shot.
Ouch.
They decided the other bear had to be put down as well.
What?
They're too dangerous to keep around.
Ugh. That's disgusting.
It's not like they can just release it into the woods of outside Philadelphia.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. They had it shipped in.
The bears remained in the museum as mounted taxidermy.
Ugh. A grim reminder of humans' lust for power.
Yep, these bears introduced the eastern United States to the grizzly bear and proved that even if raised in captivity, they cannot be tamed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's best to leave things as they are.
Yep.
That's going to bring us around to top 5 presidential pet.
Number 2.
Andrew Jackson's parrot. Andrew Jackson bought a parrot as a gift for his beloved wife, Rachel, and he kept the parrot for himself after her untimely death. It was an African gray parrot named Paul. Parrots are known for their ability to learn and repeat words and phrases. So, what kind of words and phrases did Paul learn from President Jackson? Well, we actually know a little bit about that due to an infamous incident at Jackson's funeral in 1845, where Paul the parrot had to be removed from the service because she would not stop swearing. A witness said, "Before the sermon and while the crowd was gathering, a wicked parrot that was a household pet got excited and commenced swearing so loud and long as to disturb the people and had to be carried from the house. The parrot was excited by the multitude and let loose perfect gusts of cuss words. People were horrified and awed at the bird's lack of reverence." Jackson probably would have loved that.
Yeah.
I think he would have got a kick out of that.
Yeah, he's probably laughing in the next world. It's probably the funnest presidential funeral to attend.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Like, it got so out of control that people were like, all right, you got to get this thing out of here. And, it had to pick that up from somebody. So, it's just like, it shows you what, like, a foul-mouthed person Jackson was.
Yeah, he must
or
have
if he
been.
did that intentionally, just to, what if he was that kind of person where it's like, oh, this thing could talk, I'm just going to teach it a bunch of swear words.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, he's probably walking around the White House cussing out like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, and the parrot's picking up on it.
Yeah, parrot's picking up on it. As they do. That's going to bring us around to our top 5 presidential pet.
Number 1.
Rebecca the raccoon.
Calvin Coolidge had such a menagerie of pets at the White House that the White House was referred to as the Pennsylvania Avenue Zoo. Coolidge had at least 12 different dogs, 2 cats, 3 canaries, a goose, a donkey, and a bobcat.
Interesting, a bobcat.
But the most celebrated of all the Coolidge pets was Rebecca the raccoon. This raccoon was sent to the White House from Mississippi in 1926 to be cooked for the Coolidge's Thanksgiving dinner.
Oof.
Guess, it has fallen out of favor in modern times, but apparently baked raccoon was once a favored and treasured holiday treat in the South.
Yeah, leave it to the South.
Lincoln was the first president to pardon the White House turkey, but Coolidge is the only president to pardon the Thanksgiving raccoon.
That's right.
The Coolidge family found the raccoon to be friendly and docile, and rather than eat her, decided to keep her as a pet. Coolidge said in a press conference that the raccoon is very playful, very interesting, and seems very well trained and well behaved. He asked the press to help come up with a name, and on Christmas Eve, 1926, she was christened Rebecca the raccoon. Rebecca was a favorite of First Lady Grace Coolidge, who wrote, quote, "We had a house made for her in one of the large trees with a wire fence built around it for protection. We kept her chained when out of doors, but in the house she had her liberty. She was a mischievous, inquisitive party, and we had to keep watch of her when she was in the house. She enjoyed nothing better than being placed in a bathtub with a little water in it and given a cake of soap with which to play. In this fashion, she would amuse herself for an hour or more." Wonder if that was the same bathtub that John Quincy Adams'
the gator was kept
kept
in, perhaps.
President Coolidge would walk around with Rebecca hanging on his neck. They'd carry her around like a cat. The Coolidges loved Rebecca, but not everybody was a fan. Some of the White House staff disliked her because she would knock over plants, tear clothing and upholstery, and unscrew light bulbs. In 1928, the Coolidges were given a male raccoon, Reuben, as a companion for Rebecca. So they're trying to set her up with a boyfriend, perhaps produce a litter of baby raccoons for the White House, but Rebecca was having none of that. The 2 raccoons did not get along, and Reuben soon escaped the White House grounds and ran away. Rebecca also escaped a few times, and the Coolidges feared for her safety if she would continue to get out, so they gave her to the local zoo.
Yeah, you can't completely take the wild out of something like that, but for, a pretty much undomesticated animal,
Yeah.
Rebecca was pretty remarkable, and there are pictures you could look up of her on Grace Coolidge's neck.
Yeah.
And
they're holding her like a cat.
yeah. It was
It's pretty funny Coolidge talking about her in a press conference.
Yeah.
Like, I'm the president, it's called a press conference.
Yeah, I have a feeling
Very
he's probably
important things to
annoyed. It was
say.
probably a question that came up,
they're
and he was probably
asking him about it.
he was probably miffed that they brought that up. But we also got an honorable mention here. We wanna talk about Theodore Roosevelt,
Yeah.
who had a veritable menagerie of White House pets that far exceeded even Coolidge's Pennsylvania Avenue Zoo.
Yeah.
As we know, TR was a naturalist, and he collected thousands of animal specimens for the Smithsonian. He also had young children during his presidency, and they were fond of pets.
Yeah.
So the TR White House had at least 11 horses, 6 dogs, 2 cats, 2 parrots, 2 kangaroo rats, numerous snakes, a badger, a flying squirrel, a hyena, a wildcat, a coyote, an owl, some chickens, a pig, a raccoon, 5 guinea pigs, 5 bears, a zebra, and a lion.
Wow.
You may be asking, why isn't he number 1?
Well, I don't know. He just has so many different pets. I don't know if any one of them is famous.
Yeah, there's not. That's the thing.
He just
If it
merits,
was top 5 presidential animal enthusiasts,
yeah, he definitely.
then I
be number
suppose
one.
TR would take the number 1 spot. But we have to go with Rebecca the Raccoon based on personality. And then a second honorable mention, we might as well bring up Richard Nixon and Checkers.
Yeah, we didn't include any dogs in the list.
Yeah, we didn't include any dogs in the list, and that was for a reason. But if you're interested in presidential pets, I mean, Checkers may be the most famous presidential dog.
Yeah, he has a famous speech named after him.
Famous speech that Nixon gave. So that was our top 5. Let's give it a little shout out to www.presidentialpetmuseum.com. A nice comprehensive source that you guys can check out to learn all about presidential pets.
Yeah, learn about your favorite
over the
president's favorite pets.
That's our top 5, and we'll be back with the early life of Andrew Jackson. Right after this, a word from our sponsors. Thanks for tuning in. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Dixon's Grocery, which has an exciting offer for our listeners. Pure sperm candles on sale at Dixon's Grocery. 30 boxes of superior sperm candles being perfectly white and dry are available now. Our friendly neighborhood grocer, Mr. Dixon, has been hard at work pumping out these pure sperm candles. I personally cannot fathom the labor that goes into making 30 boxes of them. Personally, I think it'd take me weeks or close to it just to make one candle's worth.
I think they mean sperm whale oil.
Sperm whale oil. Not semen.
No.
I guess that makes more sense. I thought they were going for like a, chestnut dreams type, from what I hear. Okay. Anywho, so these bad boys come not from Mr. Dixon, but from Moby Dick. Listeners, get on down to Dixon's Grocery and pick yourself up a box of high-quality, pure sperm whale oil candles, guaranteed to contain no human semen. That's a message from our sponsor, Dixon's Grocery.
We're also proud to be sponsored by Uriah Levison, who has available for sale Hunter's Red Drop. Those afflicted with venereal disease may find a safe and certain cure for the most dreadful of all diseases. That cure is Hunter's Red Drop. Thanks to Dr. Hunter of Gothenburg, the venereal disease is disarmed of all its terrors.
Wow.
A single bottle of this infallible remedy is now proved to be sufficient in the most inveterate cases. The medicine is prompt and decisive in its effects and requires but a few days and frequently but a few hours to remove every vestige of poison from the system.
That's impressive.
It may be said to act like magic without any ill consequences or inconveniences whatsoever.
Wow.
It is also such that the most intimate friend cannot detect the use of it.
Now that is just simply amazing.
The unfortunate should consider Dr. Hunter as their guardian angel in rescuing them from the fangs of a disease in which many have been brought to the brink of the grave, and by an application of Dr. Hunter's drops have been restored to perfect health and their wonted purity. Our sponsor, Uriah Levison, warrants this medicine to effect a perfect cure in all cases. After selling it for 3 years, out of thousands of cases, not one has failed. The sufferer will be clear of the venereal poison and as pure as the day they were born.
Now, James, we have had some venereal cure sponsors on our show before, and I'm not going to lambaste any one of them, but my God, Uriah Levison may have something here.
Yeah, really.
This has to be incredibly expensive. Who could afford such a miracle cure?
Well, that's what you might think, but it's just $1 per bottle.
$1 a bottle? My God.
$1 a bottle.
Where could you get this?
It is available exclusively at Uriah Levison's shop at number 30 Division Street.
You said 30 Division Street. I'm asking for a friend.
Number 30 Division Street. Okay. All interviews will be strictly confidential, of course.
Very nice.
Keep your secret with Hunter's Red Drop.
My friend that I was asking for, he's going to be really happy to know about that.
It's important.
It is.
Spread the word.
Speaking of important, we have an important message from our sponsor, Michael Keating. Whereas Celestia, my wife, has left my bed and board and refuses to live with me, and by improper and disgraceful conduct has rendered herself unworthy of my protection and assistance. This notice is therefore to caution all persons against harboring or trusting her on my account, as I shall pay no debts of her contracting after this date. Well, there you have it, listeners. A story oft told. We're not going to sully this podcast with the tawdry details of Celestia Keating's disgraceful conduct, but suffice to say that she's stained herself with more than a few candles worth of something, and we're not talking about whale oil. If Michael ever considered taking her back into his bed, he'd have to pick up some Hunter's Red Drop just to protect himself. This much is for sure.
Yep.
Her purity is beyond restoration. Listeners, if your spouse has engaged in scandalous infidelity and you want to call them out on our show, go ahead and hit us up on Twitter at DeadPrezPodcast, that's Prez with a Z, where you could learn more about our sponsors and see their original ads published in newspapers during Andrew Jackson's presidency. And now, back to the show. And we're back with this, the 7th episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast, and we're discussing Andrew Jackson, a pivotal figure, probably the most important figure in the the new generation of American politics.
Yeah.
But it didn't all start out like that for Andrew Jackson. We're going to dive into his pre-presidential life here. We're going to start with the boyhood of Andrew Jackson and his
humble beginnings.
Yeah, his not just humble beginnings, but his pretty incredible rise.
Yeah. Yeah, he was born in 1767, the same year as John Quincy Adams, but, under less auspicious circumstances, really, than any other president yet. Jackson, the first president not to be born in Virginia or Massachusetts. His parents were born in Ireland, only immigrated to the United States a couple years before his birth. Jackson was born in the remote Waxhaw region on the border between North and South Carolina.
Yeah, so even his birth is going to begin with controversy, and it's just going to be his entire life.
Yeah, it's actually unclear which of the two states he was born in, North or South Carolina.
And they actually argue about it.
Yeah, different people said different things. He had uncles living on both sides of the border, was born at one of the uncles' houses, not necessarily known exactly which one.
Yeah, I believe the story was he was on his way from one to the other when the birth occurred.
Yeah.
Well, not he was on his way. I guess technically he was on his way from within the womb from one spot to the other, and at some point he was born, and they're not sure exactly
it happened
the
in
technicality of state line and which state could claim him. Both have tried.
Yeah, it was a time of confusion for the Jackson family. Andrew Jackson, born in a crisis just a few weeks before his birth. His father, Andrew Jackson Sr., died in a logging accident.
Right.
Leaving his mother, Elizabeth, a widow with now 3 sons, little means to support a family. They lived mostly with aunts and uncles throughout Jackson's childhood, never really had a house of their own. Jackson's mother wanted him to become a Presbyterian minister, and so she sent him to school from the ages of 8 to 13, which was a better education than his older brothers had received. And it was really maybe even typical of what was the frontier at the time where he lived.
Absolutely, it was.
In 1776, a 9-year-old Andrew Jackson read aloud the Declaration of Independence for his illiterate neighbors. See, the first 6 presidents were all born into more or less prominent families. They came from the country's, quote-unquote, natural aristocracy. Right. And they had relatively privileged upbringings. But Jackson, he's the first president who's born into a family who had nothing. And his childhood was all hardship.
He literally was a man of the people. And that's going to play importantly into his image.
That was his political image. And it had, deep roots in where he came from.
Right. I believe that Jackson himself considered himself a North Carolinian by birth, but he never considered himself a North Carolinian. He considered himself a Tennessean.
Yeah.
Once he got out there. And that was that. Just as a follow-up to the birth controversy, I believe he himself considered himself to have been born in North Carolina.
Well, Tennessee was part of North Carolina at the time.
That could have been something that was because, I don't want to be from where John C. Calhoun's from.
Yeah. How would Jackson know where he was born? He was only 1 day old at the time.
Yeah, how would he know? He was just a baby.
Yeah. Well, his childhood was very hard, and he had to fight his whole life for everything that he had. Starting at a young age, the British invaded the South in the second half of the Revolutionary War. Jackson's oldest brother, Hugh, joined the army and died of heat exhaustion. In 1780, the war came right to Jackson's doorstep with the Waxhaw Massacre, where the British slaughtered some Americans attempting to surrender. And that's when 14-year-old Andrew Jackson and his 17-year-old brother Robert began attending militia drills and served as couriers for the Revolutionary Army. So he's too young to necessarily fight as a full soldier, but he's in there.
He's in there.
And
it's going to lead to
more
let's
hardship.
say a scarring incident.
Yeah, in 1781, Jackson and his brother Robert were captured by the British Army. British officer ordered Jackson to polish his boots, and Jackson refused. He said, "I'm not your servant. I'm a prisoner of war and claim to be treated as such." The officer swung his sword at Jackson, who partially blocked it with his left hand, though it still hit him in the head, leaving scars on his head and hand that he would proudly display for the rest of his life. His brother Robert also refused to polish the officer's boots and was also hit in the head with a sword. In their captivity with the British, Jackson and his brother both contracted smallpox.
Not looking too good.
No. Well, the British released them after 2 weeks, but they took Jackson's shoes and coat, and he had to walk 45 miles home, barefoot, with smallpox.
Yeah.
His brother Robert was much sicker than he was and rode home on their only horse. When they got home, Robert died from smallpox and the untreated sword wound to his head.
Yeah.
Jackson was dangerously ill, but his mother nursed him back to health.
And it was his mother that was leading them back.
Yeah.
They were released to her care, and she had to walk them back. There was the one horse. The brother was seriously, seriously ill, and he got it. So Jackson and his mom had to walk that length.
Yeah, she was a tough lady and a big example to her son. And as soon as Jackson recovered, his mother went to Charleston to care for 2 sick nephews, and Jackson never saw her again. She died in Charleston, and he wasn't able to bring her body home. He never even found her gravesite. And that was really hard for him. He's now lost his father before he was born, both of his brothers, and his mother. He's now totally an orphan. He greatly admired his mother and never forgot her last words to him, which he later recalled as, quote, "the law of my life." She told him, "In this world you will have to make your own way. In personal conduct, be always polite, but never obsequious. None will respect you more than you respect yourself. Avoid quarrels as long as you can without yielding to imposition, but sustain your manhood always."
So Andrew Jackson, at 15 years old, is now totally alone in the world.
Yeah, he has nobody, but he gets a little bit of a windfall right around the time he lost his mother. He also lost a grandfather in Ireland who left him £350 inheritance, which is a decent little sum that he could have invested.
Yeah.
Lived on for a while.
Move on and try and figure something out. What's he going to do?
Instead, he squandered the entire inheritance, gambling and carousing in Charleston,
and making
South
quite
Carolina.
a name for himself in the process.
Yeah, he did make a name for himself as a young man, as a guy who
a bit of a hellion,
liked a good time, a bit of a prankster and a gambler and a drinker. But after he lost this inheritance, he determined that he wanted to succeed. He wanted to buckle down. He tried his hand as a saddle maker and a school teacher before he moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, to study law. In 1787, he was admitted to the North Carolina bar.
Then it's time for a westward move.
Yep.
This is a big thing at the time. Many, many people are doing this. And so in 1788, Jackson decides to haul out west a little bit and moves to Nashville, Tennessee, still part of western North Carolina at this point in time.
Yeah, if you're a young man back east who has nothing, you own no land, you don't have any family, go west, young man, and make a name for yourself out
That's
there.
it.
That's what Andrew Jackson did. Nashville, Tennessee being, like the western frontier of the United States at the time.
Yeah.
A wild place that he helped bring law and order to as serving as a district attorney. Began to make connections with prominent Tennesseans, including Colonel John Donaldson, in whose home he boarded.
And this is going to be a pretty significant move.
Yeah, because who else lived in John Donaldson's home but his young daughter, Rachel, who Jackson soon fell in love with, and Rachel loved him back. So it's going to be a great...
Seems pretty perfect, but
happily ever after scenario, right?
There's just one little glitch, one little problem.
Oh, what's that?
Well, Rachel's already married. At the age of 17, she married a man by the name of Louis Robards in Kentucky, but he was insanely jealous. He repeatedly accused her of having affairs with other men. He sent her back to her parents in Tennessee, where she meets Andrew Jackson. So basically, she's involved with something of a louse. And she goes back. Her husband sends her back.
Yeah, he wants to get rid of her, sends her back to her parents. There she meets and falls in love with Jackson. Later, the husband comes and takes her back to Tennessee, but he's still treating her like shit. And so Jackson goes and rescues her, bringing her back home to Tennessee to her parents' house. And in 1790, Robards obtained the legislative permission to file for divorce. And then, perhaps mistaking this as a final divorce decree, Jackson and Rachel married in 1791.
There's a problem here.
Yeah, the divorce decree wasn't actually issued until 1793.
So the initial marriage is invalid.
Yeah.
So they have to get married again.
Yeah, they married again legally in 1794.
And this is going to be such a problem. I mean, this is going to be basically what forever alters Jackson as a man, as a president.
Yeah, it became a big scandal that haunted him later, but it really wasn't much of a scandal at the time.
No.
The frontier settlers didn't care, and the thing was
it got dug up later and used as dirt in the election
Jackson's
campaign.
whole relationship and courtship with Rachel, he had the full support of her very prominent family.
Right.
So it wasn't considered shady at the time because the family was on board with it.
Yeah.
And it only became...
And it's a respected family.
Yeah. They were, very prominent family, and they wanted Jackson and Rachel to be married. But later she was, slammed as an adulteress and a bigamist.
Yeah.
Which would have dire consequences for the Jackson marriage. Although it seems like they had a very loving marriage.
Oh, they were absolutely devoted to each other, and that goes absolutely without question. They never had any children. So that's led some to believe that one of them was probably infertile.
Yeah, she didn't have any previous children with her original
as
husband.
we know, Washington, as a result of smallpox, might not have been able to bear children. Jackson may have been, and this could be the first sign of the kind of Washington resemblance here. Mm-hmm. That they're going to play up a little bit later.
Yeah, they later, they had legally adopted one of Rachel's nephews, whom they named Andrew Jackson Jr., and they had lots of other children and family members in their home that they took care of. Despite not having children of their own, they tried to make their own family.
And in the meantime, Jackson's making a name for himself in Tennessee.
Yeah, he's becoming a big deal out on the frontier because he's a very fearless, take charge kind of guy, which gets him a lot of respect in that kind of community. One time they were, as a lawyer, on his way to a session of court. A group of lawyers traveling through the wilderness encountered some hostile Indians. Jackson led his party on a harrowing escape from the Indians, during which he almost went over a waterfall. But that's the kind of guy he is.
Certainly rough and tumble.
Yep. 1796, Tennessee became a state. Jackson was a delegate to the state constitutional convention. Same year, got elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And the following year, the Tennessee state legislature sent him to the U.S. Senate.
Pretty meteoric rise.
Yeah, but he wasn't.
But he's not satisfied.
He didn't like Congress. He was in Congress for about 5 months before he resigned. He was impatient with its sluggish pace. Not really a deliberative legislative kind of guy. He then served several years as a justice on the Tennessee Supreme Court, which he also resigned from. I think he wasn't...
Just can't find satisfaction.
Well, he wasn't... Legislative and judicial power didn't suit him. He wanted executive power.
Yeah.
And in 1802, he was elected Major General of the Tennessee State Militia, which is what he really wanted to do. But before he gets a chance to do anything like that, he's going to get himself into some scrapes.
He has some activities in addition to his public service.
Yeah.
He's a plantation owner. He ran a trading post, raised gamecocks, participated in the cockfights.
Loved cockfights.
But his greatest passion was breeding and racing horses. And this is going to lead to a problem.
Yeah, he's a big horse racing guy, big gambles, made a big wager on his prized racehorse, Truxton, to go up against a horse owned by Joseph Irwin. But Irwin's horse went lame and had to drop out of the race, and there turned out to be a really nasty dispute about how the prearranged forfeit fee was going to be paid. And there was some back and forth, and then Irwin's son-in-law, Charles Dickinson, called Jackson, quote, a coward and an equivocator.
Ouch.
And then in May 1806, published a statement in the newspaper calling Jackson, quote, a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward.
Damn.
Jackson is not about to let those words stand.
No, that's some serious shade they're throwing. He's not going to back down.
Jackson challenged Dickinson to a duel, and they traveled across the border to Kentucky for that purpose.
How are Jackson's odds looking here?
Maybe not good, because Dickinson is considered an expert shot. And Jackson, strategizing before the duel, decided it might be better to let Dickinson shoot first, hoping that he would rush his shot and give Jackson more time to aim.
A very risky gambit.
Yep. And
so how did it go?
Well, Dickinson did shoot first, and he hit Andrew Jackson right in the chest.
But something almost miraculous happens. Jackson doesn't grab his chest and stagger backward and sink to his knees.
Nope.
Choking on his own blood.
He stands his ground, and he's going to take his shot.
As a matter of fact, Dickinson thought that he had missed.
Yeah, because Jackson didn't...
Jackson carried himself so Well, he said, according to, Dickinson's initial thought, according to testimony given by his second, was that his shot had missed. And Jackson's his brief reaction from being shot in the chest was actually just a wince. And then, instead of any type of reaction, Jackson very slowly, very deliberately takes aim and takes his shot.
And Dickinson falls dead to the ground.
Jackson's boot is filled with blood. He is seriously wounded. The bullet almost hit his heart, and there was no way to safely get it out. That bullet would remain in his body for the rest of his life. Jackson told a friend, "If he had shot me through the brain, sir, I should still have killed him." It's the fierce iron tenacity of Andrew Jackson.
Yep, he just seems to have this implacable willpower that carries him through all obstacles in all situations.
Just seems to be unstoppable.
Never gives up or backs down. The next big thing in his career, we talked about in the Jefferson episode, the Burr conspiracy, in which the disgraced former Vice President Aaron Burr tried to organize a private expedition to possibly invade Spanish territories like Texas and Mexico, or maybe possibly to prompt Western states to separate from the Union.
Yeah, you know all about that.
In 1805, Burr was in the early stages of this plot when he visited Nashville and was hosted by Andrew Jackson, the leader of the Tennessee militia, who was very eager for an opportunity to put it to use. Burr was implying that the United States would soon be going to war with Spain, and Jackson wanted in on it.
Yes.
He accepted money from Burr to build flatboats and acquire supplies for the expected war. But in 1806, however, an associate of Burr visited Jackson, casually let slip that Burr might be intending to capture New Orleans.
Whoops.
Jackson was pissed. This is not what he was trying to get involved in. He fired off letters to President Jefferson, warning him about the plot and distancing himself from it. Jackson learned that General James Wilkinson, the top general in the U.S. Army, was supposedly Burr's co-conspirator. Now,
Jackson's not a big fan of this guy.
Jackson hated Wilkinson and blamed him for the whole thing. Wilkinson, he turned on Burr, denied his own involvement, and had Burr's friends arrested. Jackson actually went to Burr's treason trial in Richmond and stated his belief that Burr only ever had honorable intentions and that anything nefarious was coming from Wilkinson.
This leads to Burr being acquitted and Wilkinson's reputation being pretty severely tarnished. But he's going to hold on to his command, and he's going to get an opportunity for revenge against Andrew Jackson.
Yep. When the War of 1812 broke out, Jackson finally got his shot at military glory. In January 1813, he led 2,000 Tennessee volunteers out of Nashville down towards New Orleans to help with the defense of that city. But the U.S. Army commander at New Orleans was Wilkinson, who hated Jackson and also feared that Jackson might be taking over his command. And so Wilkinson worked to undermine him. Wilkinson, a master of political infighting and backbiting.
Yeah.
He wants to throw a monkey wrench in Jackson's expedition. So he ordered Jackson to halt at Natchez in the Mississippi Territory. And Jackson is totally reliant on the U.S. Army for supplies and food for his men. So he kind of has to obey. And while they're languishing in Natchez, Jackson's army began to fall ill. Jackson himself got a chest cold, exacerbated by Charles Dickinson's bullet, which was still in his chest. Jackson was left debilitated, and Wilkinson's maneuverings prompted the new war secretary to send Jackson an order to disband his army.
This means some severe consequences.
Yeah, because they're way down in Natchez, Mississippi.
Yeah.
If he disbands the army, that would mean basically abandoning his men
And
to
they're
their own
sick.
devices.
They're sick and they're without supplies somewhere in the Mississippi Territory. And Jackson's not going to let that stand.
No, he considers himself a father figure toward his men, and he's not going to leave them hanging. So he ignored the order to disband and instead led his army on a grueling march back to Tennessee, refusing to leave a single man behind.
So he disobeys orders.
Yeah, basically. He got his men home. He secured food from the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians, promising to pay for it himself if the government wouldn't pay, which would have ruined him financially.
Yeah. Some pretty bold promises.
But like I guess he would do repeatedly throughout his political career, he bet that the people would back his actions and carry him through, and that was true. He ended up being highly praised by the people of Tennessee.
Sure enough,
for
they did.
saving his men and his army, and ultimately the War Department did agree to pay for the supplies. And this was the incident where his, determined leadership prompted his troops to say that he was as tough as Hickory, and that's where he got the nickname Old Hickory.
Yeah. So you have a guy taking a severe gamble here. And this is basically going to be another theme in Jackson's life, is he's willing to take these chances.
Yeah,
He blatantly disregarded his orders and
and later it
did
ended
this.
up, yeah.
And it ended up working out really good for him.
Yeah, the War Department had to backpedal, and they claimed that, when they sent the order to disband, they thought that Jackson and his men were still in Tennessee, so they never intended to make him disband way down there, but, it's just the distances involved that, make it hard to control a war from Washington, D.C., and Jackson feels free to take his own initiative, and it ended up working out for him here.
But not completely.
Well, one of the...
We're going to have a problem.
He's beloved of most of his men, but one of the colonels who served under Jackson on the Natchez expedition was Thomas Hart Benton, who was a young lawyer and protege of Jackson, and he was actually the one who went to Washington, D.C. and secured payment for the supplies.
And he's going to be of continual import.
Yeah, he becomes a major political figure. But here he's only a young man, and while he's away in Washington, D.C., his brother, Jesse Benton, fought a duel with another of Jackson's officers, William Carroll. And then Jackson had reluctantly served as Carroll's second in that duel, and both of those duelists suffered minor gunshot wounds. And when Thomas Hart Benton came back from D.C. and heard about all this, he was pissed at Jackson.
Yeah.
He feels Jackson is the mature, older
should
general.
Should have mediated this situation somehow.
You should have cooled these young men down and worked this out. Instead, you're participating in a duel and my brother is getting shot. He accused Jackson of conducting the affair, quote, in a savage, unequal, unfair, and base manner.
Ouch.
And so now there's bad blood. And soon thereafter, Jackson and Colonel John Coffey encountered the Bentons outside a hotel in Nashville, and a good old-fashioned Wild West gunfight broke out.
On God.
It's disputed whether Jackson or Thomas Benton drew their pistol first, but the first one to fire was Jesse Benton, who shot Jackson in the left shoulder, shattering the bone and severing an artery. and in the left arm. Jackson squeezed off a shot before he fell. Coffey and Thomas Benton were also shooting. Two of Rachel Jackson's nephews were nearby and dove into the fray. Jesse Benton was about to shoot one of them in the heart at point-blank range, but his gun misfired. Bystanders broke up the brawl, and Jackson was the only one seriously wounded.
Wow, what a scene.
But he's, like, dying. He has a severed artery. Doctors decided they needed to amputate his left arm to save his life. So I guess Jackson is our first one-armed president?
Hell no. Jackson absolutely refused, and they didn't dare cross him.
No. He frightened the doctors into not cutting off his arm, and it worked out.
Yes, the bleeding just stopped on its own. It kind of... It must have just nicked the artery somehow. I can't imagine this, you know... Maybe it's grown apocryphally over time, but I don't know about severing an artery and not having anything done about it. It might have nicked it. It might have just been a very, very severe. It's.
Well, he ended up living.
One of the mysteries of history, but yeah, he was shot, and it was bad, and he ended up pulling through it.
Thomas Hart Benton afterward.
The second time that this has happened.
Yeah. He's already been shot on two different occasions. Afterward, Thomas Hart Benton believed that Jackson's friends were out for his blood, so he skipped town and moved to Missouri. And later, by the time Jackson would become president, Benton would be a powerful senator from Missouri.
And he's going to come into some play.
We'll see how that plays out for Jackson later.
But in the meantime, Jackson's bedridden for 3 weeks after the gunfight. However, less than 2 weeks after he's back on his feet, he's back in the field leading an army.
Yeah, he's not going to let a little near-fatal gunshot wound stop him.
He'd been shot before. He's like, this is just part of it.
Yeah.
He's back up and at him.
So he gets out of bed, and he's back at the head of an army, because over the summer of 1813, a civil war broke out among the Creek Indians, who lived mostly in the Mississippi Territory, mostly what is now Alabama. Some Creeks favored increased cultural and economic ties with white settlers, but a militant group of Creeks known as the Red Sticks wanted to heed the call of Shawnee leader Tecumseh and go to war against the United States with British aid.
See, now Washington could have avoided this whole thing by just calling themselves the Washington Red Sticks.
Perhaps.
You know? Come on, use your head.
Creeks who opposed the war and were friendly to the United States were targeted with violence. In August 1813, the Red Sticks launched a surprise attack on Fort Mims, which was a center of trade between Creeks and white settlers, and they massacred 250 people, including Americans and Creeks friendly to the Americans. This sparked a panic in the United States, and Jackson's Tennessee militia was ordered to crush the Red Sticks. In October 1813, Jackson marched out of Tennessee with about 2,000 men, including a young Davy Crockett and a young Sam Houston. In November, at the Battle of Talladega, 700 Red Sticks had surrounded a stockade where American-friendly Creeks were holed up when Jackson attacked and killed 300 of them.
Just a sudden surprise attack.
By March 1814, Jackson was joined by Indian allies from the Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw tribes. At that point, he fought the Battle of Horseshoe Bend.
And, of course, these allies would all later live to regret helping him.
Perhaps. It did not work out for them in the long run.
But back to real time, the Red Sticks are fortified behind a breastwork and a riverbend. And Jackson's artillery, they're not doing any damage. So what's Jackson to do? He orders a bayonet charge, while some other men under John Coffey cross the river and surround the Red Sticks. Now let's get into the statistics here, and this is a somber report.
Yep, it was not a very, it turned out to be a lopsided battle. Out of 1,000 Red Sticks, 800 were killed. Jackson lost only 50 men.
As a result, Jackson would be commissioned a major general in the United States Army and ordered to conclude a peace treaty with the Creeks that would include land cessions to indemnify the U.S. for its losses.
Yeah, now he's not just a Tennessee militia general anymore. Now he gets commissioned in the regular army.
Yeah.
He's really making now a national name for himself.
Yeah, he's got his big boy britches on.
Yeah, and now he's charged with executing national Indian policy. But to conclude the Creek War, it's going to involve the Creeks ceding 21 million acres of land to pay for the crime of attacking the United States. But
a harsh penalty.
A lot of the land that they ceded was the land bordering Florida, which had mostly been occupied by the Creeks that were loyal to the United States. In this negotiation, Jackson didn't distinguish between the friendly and unfriendly Creeks. He lumped them all into one basket and took a shitload of land from them. His position was that it's necessary for U.S. security to separate the Creek Indians from the British and Spanish foreign powers operating in Florida that would incite them against the United States.
And, of course, some of the Creeks are going to reject this bullshit and flee into Florida to join the Seminoles and continue the fight.
Yep, and we'll hear later
Just
in the
prolonging a slow death, unfortunately.
Yep. Later in the episode, we will hear about the First and Second Seminole Wars.
Yeah. But Jackson is so pissed off at this point at these foreign powers that he decides to invade Spanish Florida. In October of 1814, he captures Pensacola from the British force holding it.
Yeah, this is what he'd been itching to do way back to the Burr conspiracy days, to kick these foreign powers off of what he believes ought to be U.S. soil in Florida.
Now he's had his chance and he's taken it.
And now we're going to get to the thing that really catapults Jackson to the status of
Internet, at least national, but
national
somewhat
hero.
International known.
Super stardom. At this time, if you recall the Madison episode, the British Army had burned Washington, D.C.
So we're in some trouble.
Yeah, the Creek War went okay, but the rest of the war is not going so great for the United States. The troops that burned D.C. were experienced professional soldiers who fought under the Duke of Wellington in Napoleonic Wars. And after they burned D.C., they got back on their ships and sailed away, and the rumor was that they were going to attack New Orleans. By this time, General Wilkinson is transferred to the Northern Theater, and New Orleans was practically undefended.
A dangerous position.
It was. So Jackson marched to New Orleans and started preparing a defense. He declared martial law. He dissolved the state legislature. He executed deserters. He defied a federal judge's writ of habeas corpus. He is going to whip.
This is some serious shit.
He has an army, a British professional army about to be bearing down on him. He's pulling out all the stops to get ready.
Yeah.
He's taken over. He's not going to listen to anybody who's going to get in his way. He approved an agreement with the pirates of Barataria Bay and the Lafitte brothers, who were in trouble for piracy. They were pardoned in exchange for participating in the city's defense, which was great because these pirates, they knew how to operate cannons, which is a very useful skill in this battle. Jackson put together a ragtag force of about 5,700 men, including his Tennessee and Kentucky militia, Choctaw Indians, pirates, and Louisiana volunteers, including a battalion of free African Americans. Just a hodgepodge of anybody that can hold a gun.
Any and anybody that's willing and able.
Every able-bodied man. The British landed their 8,000 seasoned veterans southeast of the city, and on December 23rd, their advance guard approached within 9 miles of New Orleans. That night, Jackson found out they were coming and marched out and attacked them, punching them in the nose and halting their advance. Jackson then took up a position 4 miles from the city and began constructing earthwork defenses behind a somewhat moat-like canal.
Yeah, we're talking a swampy territory.
Yeah, New Orleans.
Swampy terrain.
It's right along the river and lots of swamps, canals. There's very little dry land to fight on. So the British don't have much room to maneuver, and they don't really have anything they can do except make a full frontal assault on this defensive line that Jackson has built.
And sometimes it's a bad idea to go full frontal.
Yep. They were caught exposed here. On January 9th, 1815, the British attacked, exposing themselves to withering artillery and musket fire. The British 44th Regiment was supposed to bring the ladders and the implements they needed to cross the canal and scale the earthworks. They got delayed, so the men who actually made it to the front were sitting ducks for American fire. The British general in charge, Edward Pakenham, took personal command of the 44th Regiment and was trying to get them up to the front when he was killed, shot off his horse by grape shot.
And that doesn't help.
Nope, the British, they made one more push, but they couldn't scale the earthworks, and they retreated. The British assault on the other side of the river did have a little bit more success, but it was too late, it was delayed, and too late to have an effect. So the British had to withdraw from New Orleans.
Now, the casualties here, we're talking 2,000 British dead, wounded.
And captured.
And on the American side, 62.
Yep, Jackson putting up some impressive stats and his casualty numbers on his battles. Already set, 25% casualty rate in the British Army is pretty huge.
Yeah. So what a huge victory, a monumental victory. What a great turning point in the war, right?
Well, technically the war already over at this time.
Oh my goodness.
Because as Jackson is beating the British at New Orleans, coming across the Atlantic Ocean is news of the Treaty of Ghent has been signed to end the war. But the news...
Unfortunate timing, or is it?
It actually turned out to be great timing.
It turned out to be greatly fortuitous because it gave birth to American legend.
Yeah, news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans swept through the United States just before the news of the treaty. So even though the treaty just, restored the status quo antebellum and was technically a tie because it came on the heels of the miracle at New Orleans, it made the United States feel like they won the war. Yeah.
And this puts Jackson in a position pretty much unprecedented to another American individual since Washington.
Yeah,
in all honesty, he is a national figure. He is an absolute hero.
Yeah, he's the first really big national military hero.
And immediately after this, there's already talks of Andrew Jackson for president. It's like the next Washington.
Yeah.
They're heralding him.
Yeah, even the next year in 1816, some people maybe wanted him to run for president.
He didn't have any interest at that point.
No. And it was still, Monroe was still there. The Virginia dynasty still in line. But Jackson's now a major player on the national stage. January 9th became a day of celebration, almost like July 4th.
Yeah.
It's like the junior version of the 4th of July.
Exactly.
And it was celebrated as a major holiday throughout Jackson's lifetime. He's now a pretty big deal.
Yeah. He's come from rags to not necessarily riches, but somewhat
to fame.
Certainly fame.
During the Monroe presidency, a couple years after the Creek War that Jackson won, now the Seminole Indians, which include some of the Red Sticks who fought Jackson, begin raiding into Georgia from their sanctuaries in Spanish Florida. President Monroe ordered Jackson to stop the incursions.
Jackson has some plans of his own.
Yeah, he had some bigger things in mind. This is Jackson, willing to operate independently of his orders.
I mean, would he follow his orders? Not quite. He would far exceed them.
He followed his orders and then some.
Yes.
So he didn't necessarily find a lot of Seminole Indians attacking, but he invaded Florida. He destroyed Seminole villages. He captured Pensacola again, not from the Spanish, not from the Seminole Indians that he's supposed to be going after. He just straight up overthrows the Spanish governor of Florida.
Huge.
He also summarily executed 2 British subjects that he believed were inciting the Seminoles to war, so potentially causing major problems with Spain and Britain. As you may recall from the Monroe episode, the War Secretary John C. Calhoun and Treasury Secretary William Crawford wanted Monroe to condemn Jackson's actions, but Monroe sided with Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who recognized that what Jackson did was very popular in the United States and might strengthen the U.S. bargaining position.
And you remember, we made a point to say that this was pretty interesting.
Yeah, because Jackson and Adams, soon to be not great friends.
Quite the opposite.
But Adams takes Jackson's side here, and Monroe sides with Adams, and they turn out to be proved right because Spain finally agrees to sell Florida to the United States after 15 or so years of us trying to get it. And Monroe named Jackson military governor of the new territory of Florida.
And so that's going to bring us to the end of Monroe's presidency. And we're wondering about who's next.
Yeah, it's 1824.
The obvious choice seems to be John Quincy Adams, but other people have other ideas.
Well, there are lots of people with lots of ideas now, because now there's, for the first time in a long time, there's no Virginia candidate to continue the Virginia dynasty. The two-party system had kind of
petered out,
gone by the wayside, as we've discussed in previous episodes.
Right.
1824 election is a free-for-all.
Yeah, we got a free-for-all on our hands for sure.
And it's the first competitive election where the people are actually voting for president.
First time we get a popular vote.
Earlier, the electoral college votes were mostly allocated by state legislatures.
Right.
That began to change, and now this election will be the first time when it's mostly popular vote, which determines the electoral college. So we've got John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, Henry Clay, William Crawford, John C. Calhoun is in the mix, but he decides to run for vice president instead. But all these guys, we got Jackson. He's the military hero.
And the people's favorite.
So he should win, right?
Sure.
Well,
we've discussed a little bit of this in the last episode. It doesn't exactly go that way.
Yeah, Jackson won 42% of the popular vote, compared with 32% for Adams and 13% each for Clay and Crawford. Jackson also won 99 electoral college votes against only 84 for Adams, 41 for Crawford, and 37 for Clay.
Crawford has a stroke in the meantime.
Yep. And because nobody has a majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives has to decide.
And who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives? I think I asked this in the last episode.
It's Henry Clay.
It's Henry Clay.
He came in fourth in the Electoral College, so he's out of it now. The House has to decide between the top three, and Crawford had a stroke.
Yeah.
But Henry Clay, he throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, who becomes the sixth president. And Jackson is left on the outside, and him and his supporters are pretty pissed.
Yeah, to say the least.
They got the most votes. They got the most electoral votes. They feel like the election was stolen from the common people.
Corrupt bargain was
by
made.
the entrenched elites. Yep. Adams named Clay Secretary of State, and that made the whole thing look like a quid pro quo that Jackson and his supporters denounced as the corrupt bargain.
And basically, he stews. And he's ready for vengeance.
Yeah, almost immediately after the 1824 election, Jackson and his supporters are already running for 1828.
Exactly.
And it became the bitterest election campaign the United States had ever seen.
Brutal. We're talking brutal.
Got really nasty and personal for kind of the first time. Jackson and his supporters painted Adams as an out-of-touch elitist, hammering away at the corrupt bargain. They also accused Adams of procuring prostitutes for the Tsar when he was a minister to Russia.
Oof.
Meanwhile, Adams' supporters lambasted Jackson for his participation in duels, his summary executions of British subjects in Florida, and, most distressingly to Jackson, attacked his wife Rachel as an adulteress and a bigamist.
Now that's beyond the pale.
That's how Jackson felt. So his old, shady marriage situation gets dredged up and paraded before the world, and whom he believes his innocent, virtuous wife is being called a whore by everybody who's against him in the election. But and it gets real nasty.
It's beyond nasty, but this time, there's no third party candidate to split the vote, and you have a serious political machine being born. Senator Martin Van Buren of New York, pretty much with Jackson, creates the modern Democratic Party.
Yeah, Jackson gets the New York State Van Buren gets the New York State political machine to support Jackson.
And that's huge.
And that solidifies kind of the regional alliance that made the Democratic Party. Jackson won the popular vote 56 to 44% in the Electoral College, 178 to 86. A crushing victory over the incumbent, John Quincy Adams.
A wonderful triumph. So what could possibly go wrong? What could mar this great victory?
Well,
nothing other than a dark cloud in the guise of the angel of death.
Tragedy
that was visiting
struck
poor Rachel Jackson.
Beloved Rachel Jackson was devastated by the attacks that had been made against her, and she was not looking forward to 4 more years of Jackson's enemies dragging her through the mud.
And potentially more than that.
Yep. On December 22nd, 1828, Rachel had a heart attack and died. Jackson blamed his political enemies, saying at her funeral, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers. I never can."
And that's going to lead us into the presidency of Andrew Jackson. We'll be back after these messages.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Thomas Berry, new owner of the celebrated thoroughbred stud horse Cock of the Rock. You may recall our last episode when our sponsor A.W. Barnum was offering up Cock of the Rock stud services to a limited number of lucky mares. Well, our new sponsor, Thomas Berry, has recently acquired Cock of the Rock for a king's ransom, and he is once again standing to cover mares this season. Admittedly, his price has gone up. It's now $40 a mare, but we now have even more undeniable proof of his incomparable ability to beget racing champions.
That's right.
Listeners, you've never owned a racehorse until you've owned one sired by Cock of the Rock. He is the official stud horse of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
That's right. Cock of the Rock is now retired from the track, but in his day, he was a superior racehorse, having won many capital races against fine racehorses. He beat the renowned Little John and the celebrated Revenge. He beat Black-Eyed Susan, Don Juan, Romp, Boxer, James Fitzjames, Gentle Kitty, and so many others throughout his storied career. He once won four 4-mile heats in one day, running 16 miles and dominating the field with his superior stamina. No other horse west of the Allegheny can boast such a victory or anything to compare to it.
Yeah, really the only horse you can compare with Cock of the Rock is his own brother, the legendary, undefeated American Eclipse. And when American Eclipse famously beat Henry before 60,000 spectators, including
Andrew Jackson.
He did it by training with his brother, Cock of the Rock. Cock of the Rock possesses precisely the same blood in the same degrees as American Eclipse and surpasses him in the head, neck, shoulders, and withers, and fully equals him everywhere else in stamina, finish, and perfection of form. Cock of the Rock is 15 hands, 3 inches high, possessing a large share of bone and muscle. His feet are excellent, heels narrow, hoofs deep. He has a fine muzzle and nose, an elegant ear. His eye is very hearty and good. Not to mention another part of him that's going to make your mares happy.
Let's just say if men want to be hung like a horse, horses want to be hung like Cock of the Rock.
Okay, we mentioned it. There never was a better horse on the continent than Cock of the Rock. A horse, a kingdom for such a horse.
Luckily, James, our listeners don't have to give a kingdom for such a horse. For a mere $40 stud fee, they can have the next Cock of the Rock in their very own stables. His offspring are proven winners. At the 1828 Port Kent races, the first day's purse was taken by Cripple, sired by Cock of the Rock, and the second day's purse by Sir John, also sired by, you guessed it, Cock of the Rock. At the 1829 Montreal Club races, Cock of the Rock's daughter Clara Fisher took the biggest purse ever offered in Canada, winning the first and second day with ease. On the third day, Cripple distanced the competition. Just 10 days later, Clara Fisher and Cripple repeated their feat at the Port Kent races and dominated the field. Other racing champions sired by Cock of the Rock include Tom Rock, Lady Mary, Maggie Lane, and Slut. Who could forget Slut? According to A.W. Barnum, when he was training Cock of the Rock's son Robin Hood for the Port Kent races, the stewards of the track told him if he entered Robin Hood, he would destroy the sports of the field, and no other horse would enter against him. Listeners, Cock of the Rock's offspring strike fear in the hearts of other racehorses. They're afraid to compete because they know they'll get embarrassed.
Last episode, we told our listeners if they got a cult with this immaculate bloodline, pretty soon people would be paying them to cover mayors. And we can proudly report that Cock of the Rock has delivered on that promise in spades.
That's right.
We actually have 5 quick ads for sons of Cock of the Rock who are now profitable stud horses in their own right.
Listen up.
Austin Smith's Cripple will stand this season for $5 per mare. Byron and George Murray are making Sir John available at $6 a mare. William Harrington's Sir Jed is standing for $10. Gardner Davis's Robin Hood is almost fully booked but can be let to a few more mares at $15 each. And finally, Lewis Higby's aptly named Young Cock of the Rock is available for just $5 a mare. He was put to 30 mares last season and 27 came away with foals. He gets that virility from his namesake.
That's right, James. All of these proud owners invested in Cock of the Rock's stud services, and now they're making bank. You've heard of the goose that lays golden eggs. Well, Cock of the Rock is the stallion that sires golden horses. When your mare foals his offspring, she might as well be giving birth to a giant bag of money. Whether it's stud fees, racing purses, or all the big wagers you'll win, your ownership of a Cock of the Rock sired horse will be a lucrative proposition. You cannot pass up this opportunity.
Cock of the Rock is the preeminent sire of the age, and his superlative pedigree is what you want to pass on to your next generation of horses. But don't take our word for it. Go out to your stable right now and ask your mare who she wants to sire her next foal, and she'll tell you, Cock of the Rock.
This has been a message from our sponsor, Thomas Berry. And now, back to the show. And we're back, ready to dive head first into the presidency of Andrew Jackson, the first president to take office as a complete Washington outsider. This man was no real politician.
No, he railed against the corruption of the entrenched elites. He was the first, president to get elected on that kind of message, really.
He was one of the common men.
Yeah.
Well,
that's how he saw himself. Politically.
And that's how a lot of people saw him, too.
So when he became president, he was determined to clean house a bit on some federal officials who tended to hold their jobs from president to president. You know, the entrenched, this is who he's seeing as the entrenched elite, the, clerks running Washington, no matter who the president is. He wants to replace some of them with his own people who are loyal to him and reflect the will of the voters who elected him, in his view.
Right. That's important to add.
Yeah.
In his view.
So that, it caused a lot of apprehension among
the
Washington elite. Yeah. A lot of people afraid of losing their jobs. Some opponents, like Henry Clay, saw it as a disaster and kind of exaggerated, I'd say, its effect.
Well, yeah.
Overall,
I would say, yeah.
Jackson replaced 20% of the federal officials throughout his terms, which was way more than previous presidents, but it's not like he fired everybody.
No. There wasn't any complete clean sweep, but this was going to kind of become a routine, dare I say, a precedent in and of itself.
Yeah, the idea that the new president has the right to put his own people in federal offices became, a precedent more.
Yeah.
After this, became known as the spoils system.
That's it.
To the victor go the spoils.
Yeah, and that's going to lead us to the kitchen cabinet. Andrew Jackson felt that it was important to have people around him that were loyal to him. A lot of people that were in Washington looked at Jackson as this uncouth ruffian, this barbarian, and they hated him pretty much. And if they didn't hate him, he made them nervous.
Yeah.
Some of them even were afraid of him.
So he can't necessarily rely on the typical leadership class of people to support him.
No, he really can't.
So he surrounds himself with a circle of informal advisors that becomes known as the kitchen cabinet. He had lots of problems with his own cabinet, but he kept loyal advisors around him unofficially. William Lewis of Tennessee.
He'd served under Jackson in the Army and had proved instrumental in the presidential campaign. You also have Amos Kendall, Kentucky lawyer and journalist who Jackson later would name Postmaster General. A pretty important figure in the Democratic Party was Amos Kendall.
Oh, yeah. Same with Francis Preston Blair.
Exactly.
A huge figure. The journalist became editor of the Washington Globe, which became a very influential newspaper and the, mouthpiece of the Jackson Party.
That's right. We also had Andrew Jackson Donaldson, Rachel's nephew, who grew up in Jackson's household after his father's death. Donaldson served as private secretary to the president and was pretty much like a son to him. Rachel was gone. Donaldson's wife, Emily, pretty much played the role of First Lady. And their young children lived in the White House. Jackson considered them his own family.
Yeah.
He'd lost his entire family himself as a child. He never had his own biological children. He just lost his wife. And this makeshift family would become really, really important to him. And I think that it would influence some of his choices.
Yeah, but his family had a tough time staying together in the White House.
They did.
Because of a huge scandal that Jackson dealt with his entire first term. He has the kitchen cabinet, but he has big problems in the actual cabinet because he named as war secretary Tennessee Senator John Eaton, who was a big Jackson supporter and helped him get elected. But the problem was, a few months before the inauguration, Eaton married Margaret O'Neill Timberlake, recently widowed daughter of a Washington, D.C. boarding house proprietor. Yeah. That's Margaret, a.k.a. Peggy. She was beautiful and charming, but also perhaps a bit vain and indiscreet. And when the Eatons tried to enter Washington high society, they got the cold shoulder because rumors were swirling that Peggy was a woman of loose morals.
Yeah.
And this is going to
actually be a serious issue.
It's probably going to get blown way out of proportion, but it is a huge
But it actually
problem.
Politically affects the careers of people.
Yeah, Peggy's first husband, naval officer John Timberlake, was only 9 months dead when she married Eaton, and rumor had it that Peggy had something going on with Eaton while her husband was still alive.
Yeah. And the word of the day, the gossip on the streets, was that he had gotten word, her husband had gotten word, that she was carousing about. And not only that, but that she had actually gotten pregnant.
While her husband is away at sea, she allegedly got pregnant from John Eaton and had a miscarriage, so the gossip mongers say.
Yeah. And then in 1828, Timberlake dies of pneumonia at sea, but a rumor almost immediately begins to circulate that this wasn't pneumonia. This was suicide.
He was so distressed by his wife's wanton infidelity that he slit his own throat. It was claimed.
It wasn't pneumonia. It was suicide.
Now, these are all just wild rumors. in a way, but the prim and proper ladies of Washington high society, led by Floride Calhoun, wife of the vice president, John C. Calhoun, refused to have anything to do with Peggy Eaton and ostracized the Eatons from the social scene.
And the rest of Jackson's cabinet jumps on the bandwagon.
Yeah, all the ladies of Washington are really practically all on board with this ostracism. The reverend at Jackson's own church was spreading rumors about Peggy Eaton, and Jackson's own de facto first lady, Emily Donaldson, wouldn't socialize with the Eatons.
Now, this really, really strikes a nerve with Jackson. And he is immeasurably pissed off.
Yeah, he's pissed because he's loyal to his friend John Eaton. Jackson also, doesn't believe the rumors about Peggy. And it's also kind of echoing the slanders that were levied against his own wife,
the very,
Rachel.
very recent and unhealed wounds of what had happened to his own wife, Rachel Jackson. So, hence this, socially accepting the Eatons actually became a test of loyalty to the president. And only Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, whose own wife was at that point deceased, was friendly with the Eatons. This would prove a great boon to him. Whether or not he needed it, I mean, he pretty much was the guy that created the Democratic Party, the Jacksonian Democratic Party.
Yeah, Van Buren, this was really a way that he got ahead in the administration by being on
it was just, I think,
side when no one
like,
else
I was questioning whether, did he need to do this, or did he have a reputation enough on his own? And I think this was just probably added bonus.
Yeah, it definitely helped him.
Yeah. Masterful politician, Martin.
Because
Van Buren.
most other people were not passing the test of loyalty to Jackson.
Literally almost no one else was.
He ended up practically having to get rid of everyone in his administration to purge this scandal.
Yeah.
And, many of the rumors about Peggy Eaton probably false or exaggerated.
Sure.
But she was very flirtatious, and her haughty, arrogant demeanor made it hard for people to sympathize with her. We have a quote from the historian John Marsalek, who wrote about, I think he wrote a whole book about the so-called petticoat affair, as it's called. He wrote what he thought were the real reasons that Washington society found Peggy unacceptable. Quote, "She did not know her place. She forthrightly spoke up about anything that came to her mind, even topics of which women were supposed to be ignorant. She thrust herself into the world in a manner inappropriate for a woman. Except her, and society was in danger of disruption. Except this uncouth, impure, forward, worldly woman, and the wall of virtue and morality would be breached, and society would have no further defenses against the forces of frightening change. Margaret Eaton was not that important in herself. It was what she represented that constituted the threat. Proper women had no choice. They had to prevent her acceptance into society as part of their defense of that society's morality."
Ouch. That's, proper women had no choice. My God.
Well, that's what this, little potentially meaningless issue of a cabinet minister's wife's former conduct becomes ballooned into a defining question of
it hangs like a
country.
dark cloud over Jackson's entire first term. And it actually got to the point where Andrew and Emily Donaldson had to stay in Tennessee, and they weren't welcome back at the White House.
It wasn't until the end of Jackson's first term, Van Buren, who was on the right side of this thing the whole time, at least in terms of getting on Jackson's good side.
Yeah.
And advancing in the administration. He devised a kind of ingenious way to end
as
the whole
he has
thing.
a tendency to do.
Yeah, devious political move got them all out of this. And that was that Van Buren would resign as Secretary of State and that his resignation would give Eaton cover to resign without looking like he was given into all this pressure.
Right.
And then their resignations gave Jackson cover to demand the resignations of all the disloyal members of his cabinet. So he had to get rid of the entire cabinet
Yeah.
to get out of the Eaton affair at the end of his first term. He fired his whole cabinet. Well, two of them resigned and he demanded resignations like right before the election.
Pretty huge.
Which was a huge issue in the election year. It looked like chaos in the administration where the whole cabinet is dismissed. But that's what Jackson had to do to get the Eaton problem gone.
Yeah.
So that Emily and Andrew Donaldson could come back to the White House and everyone can forget about this. But the final, the last gasp, but the scandal, after the cabinet all resigned, Eaton challenged the outgoing Treasury Secretary Samuel Ingham to a duel.
Yeah.
Ingham did not accept, and Eaton raised a posse to try to hunt down Ingham in Washington, D.C., with the intention of forcing him to duel, and Ingham fled the city.
It all seems like such a petty affair, but in reality, it was a petticoat affair.
Yeah. Almost ending in blood.
Yeah.
Two cabinet ministers chasing each other through the streets with guns practically.
Madness.
All to purge the question of Peggy Eaton from the body politic.
Well, I think we need to move on to, maybe Peggy Eaton needed some of what we're about to talk about. That is up for debate. But we're about to talk about internal improvements. And federal funding for so-called internal improvements within the states, such as roads and canals, had been a major issue for decades. You'll remember from previous episodes, Madison and Monroe had vetoed internal improvements as unconstitutional, arguing that the federal government didn't have the power to spend money on local improvements. JQA supported internal improvements and got some passed, and they were a major policy of Henry Clay and his supporters. But by 1830, Jackson vetoes the Maysville Road bill that would fund a highway wholly within Kentucky. Now, this causes a little bit of a stink.
Yeah, this was all this internal improvements argument going back and forth. And whether something, an internal improvement was really local or truly national was kind of in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
But with Jackson's veto, he kind of asserts his right to make the call. He gets to be the beholder.
Yeah.
And use the veto to stop something he doesn't like. His veto message for this bill, he used the same, constitutional arguments against internal improvements, but he also made political arguments about the importance of holding spending in check and keeping taxes low to pay off the debt. And this was a new thing, because the first 6 presidents had only vetoed a total of 9 bills.
Right.
And they generally only did so because they believed the bill was unconstitutional.
George Washington himself said, quote, "From motives of respect to the legislature, I give my signature to many bills with which my judgment is at variance." Jackson did not share this view.
No, he would go on to veto 12 bills, more than all the other presidents combined. And he was the first president to assert the right to veto bills just because he disagreed with them.
Yeah.
He's not deferring to Congress the way George Washington and other presidents did.
No, if he doesn't like it, no.
Jackson rejected the view that Congress was the most representative branch of the government. So he felt like each member of Congress represents their district or their state, that they're local, and that the president is the only person that's actually elected by all the people and is therefore the most representative of national interest.
Yeah, basically Jackson said the buck stops here.
Yeah, and the Maysville Road bill was Jackson's first veto, one of the first big indications that he has a rather expansive view of the presidency and intends to throw his weight around, really, more than any other president previously had done.
Yeah.
He's kind of the first president to clash with Congress, to be unafraid to go head-to-head with Congress and really come out on top.
Yeah. And we're really about to get into that.
Yeah.
We're really about to get into that. This is well, brace yourselves, listeners. This is one of the darkest, saddest chapters in American history. Ugh.
Well, it's an issue where Jackson and the Congress were probably more on the same page.
Unfortunately.
So by Jackson's presidency, Southerners, particularly in Georgia, are agitating to get the Indian tribes to give up their land in the South in exchange for land west of the Mississippi.
Which, I should add, really wasn't ours to give.
West of the Mississippi?
Not too much.
I don't know. This was like Oklahoma type area. We had the Louisiana Purchase by this time.
I know, but I just don't feel that.
The 5 major tribes in the South.
It was an easy out, basically, is what I'm saying. It's like, well, let's offer them this shit right now, and then if we think we need it later, we'll just take it.
Yeah. The 5 tribes were the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. See, the Southerners, white people in the South wanted for the South what they felt that the North had gotten, where the Indians were kind of driven out of the Northwest through war in 1790s and the War of 1812. The whole, Ohio, Indiana country had previously been all occupied by Indians. They're gone now because of the United States basically attacked them and made them, push them out. And now the South wants the same thing for the Indians that are in the South.
Yeah.
And this had been, going on for years. There had been a bunch of big land cession treaties in the previous decades, including the Creek War with Jackson.
Yeah, I was going to say years. This has been going on for decades.
Yeah, there were lots of big... We remember from the Jefferson episode, the Jefferson quote as to our Indian policy.
Yeah.
Where we want to be friendly to them, but also either they're going to start farming and give up their land, or we're going to drive them out.
It was a lose-lose situation for the Native American Indian.
Yeah, and that decades-long policy really culminated in Jackson's presidency, where Jackson is the embodiment of the American, paternalistic view towards the Indians, where...
So-called.
Guys like Jackson will tell themselves that this is the most...
I am the great father...
Yeah. Yeah, for all years, the president of the United States was introduced to the Indians as their great father, and they were encouraged to, be friendly to the great father in Washington. And Jackson has the view that's common at the time, that Indian removal, making the Indians go west of the Mississippi, is the most humane policy and the best thing for the Indians. It's the only way to save the Indians.
And
from annihilation at the hands, really, of the white Americans.
Such a hypocritical idea, and one of the darkest blots in American history, in my opinion. It's just one of the most loathsome and disgusting episodes in American history.
It's a hypocritical...
The fact that he fooled himself, and I don't even think he could have. I think he knew. He couldn't fool himself into believing that this was in the best interest of the Native Americans.
Well, the thing is, the view's hypocritical, but it's also very realistic in the sense that it assumes as long as the Indians and white people continue to live next door to each other, that they're going to continue to go to war with each other, as they have been for generations. So it's probably realistic. And Jackson knows as well as anybody what happens to Indians when they go to war against the United States. Because he's the one who was out there in multiple wars, killing tons of Indians. He knows what the Indians face if they want to clash with the United States. So he thinks, basically to save them from guys like me.
Complete annihilation.
They need to be moved west of the
Look, to save yourself from me, you need to fuck off.
Yeah.
Just walk away. Just walk away. Walk away.
Yeah, because the
And
people
we will spare your lives.
the people of Georgia were very aggressively trying to kick the Cherokee out of their state, and that's why they're demanding this policy. And if it wasn't done, you got to assume there would be more wars. That's the thing about Indian removal. To me, it feels like the kind of policy that would be imposed as a post-war settlement. Like if all these tribes had attacked the United States and lost, this is what would be imposed as punishment for war. But the thing is, they didn't attack us. It was like a post-war settlement imposed when you just skip the war. Let's assume we had this war and just impose what we would be able to on you in that state.
Yeah, I suppose that's about it.
The legal views at the time, as stated by the Supreme Court and Chief Justice Marshall, was that Indians were not subject to state law, but they were also not really considered truly sovereign and equal nations.
Yeah, so they're in this weird purgatory between...
They're in this weird semi-sovereign, like, dependency state where the tribe doesn't really hold true legal title to their lands in the eyes of the United States legal system.
And the people yeah, exactly. The people that are saying whether or not it's legal are not them and are not representative of them. So the whole legal jargon is bullshit in regards to the fact that what are these people talking about? They just show up and claim things that people had?
Yeah, well, and under American or, Anglo-Saxon American property law, there are, one of the ways of acquiring property is by conquest.
Yeah.
Right of conquest is a way of acquiring property, and that's really what's at the bottom of all this.
Yeah.
Just
assuming they're trying to do peaceable conquest if they can.
There wasn't a war,
but they're not.
It's just
altogether.
Like assuming.
I mean, there's a lot of bullshit going on. You have smallpox blankets going around, and anything and everything to perpetrate cultural genocide upon the Native American.
When the Ohio Valley Indians sided with the British in the Revolutionary War, and at the end of the war, the British sold them out and quote-unquote gave all that land to the United States that was not British to give. It
wasn't theirs to give, yeah.
That's how then the United States then operates under the assumption that we got these lands by right of conquest, even though they didn't necessarily conquer the Indians that lived there. And so they set about over the next few decades conquering them and kicking them off.
So that's on you naughty, naughty English.
And by 1830, they're trying to do this with the Southern Indians, basically saying, let's skip the war and pretend we won and just get the fuck out. So what, the view of Americans at the time was that Indians need to give up their sovereignty and either live under state laws or leave.
Neither of which is fair.
Yeah, and it's hard to say, what would have happened. Could the Indians have been better off if they had given up their tribal sovereignty and tried to assimilate with the United States? I don't know. It's hard to imagine things turning out worse for them than they did. Yeah. But it's just not a fair choice to put.
Well, we're going to be talking about cultural assimilation after the Civil War in future episodes and see how that worked out.
Yeah, a lot of Indians did assimilate, and as the Creek Civil War showed, there was division within Indian tribes about how much, association they should have with white culture, whether they should have close ties and, assimilate and have, a large economic relationship, or whether they needed to be separate.
It's just going to get downhill from here. This is horrible, horrible, horrible stuff, but by the time we get to the 1870s, we're going to have Native American children being taken from their homes and put into schools and being forced to forget about their language and their culture and being assimilated via the government.
Yeah.
It's beginning here.
Yeah, they ultimately couldn't avoid it, I guess. Because by 1830, the Indian
couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?
No, the whole migration of white Europeans into the New World with the United States is one of the most
Disgusting.
Well, yeah, but it's also one of the most remarkable events in human history. There's never been
Remarkable is a good
human beings,
innocent way to put it.
Well, human beings started off in East Africa and spread throughout the globe.
Yeah.
But it took tens of thousands of years. Like when Native Americans came across the ice bridge from
the Bering Strait
from Russia and discovered the New World, it took them thousands and thousands of years to populate the whole of these continents
of what is now the United States
and South America.
South America, but they had their own cultures, their own cities,
right? But it took thousands and thousands of years. When white Europeans land,
they just
in the New World
take over.
Within 400 years, they've taken over the whole thing.
Yeah,
which is
it's like a real asshole cousin that comes to move in with you or something.
Mm-hmm. And so this is just when in the big picture, it just seems like an unstoppable migration of people. When the whole old world finds out about a whole new continent, everybody wants to go out there and nobody can stop them. The British government before the revolution wanted to stop people from moving further and further out west because it's just causing problems with the Indians, and the government doesn't want to deal with it, but they can't stop people from going out there.
No, because there's the lure of untold riches and unknown lands, and who knows what it could hold.
And even after independence, the United States tried to limit how people could go out and settle further and further west, and they couldn't stop them.
No, and that too is going to get worse here as we go on.
I mean, a lot of people might have liked to have the Georgians hold back against the Cherokees, but ultimately they can't stop them.
No.
Jackson deserves a lot of blame for Jackson gets a lot of blame for Indian removal policy, and he deserves it. He's like the figurehead and the biggest name associated with it, but he is by no means anywhere near alone in this.
No.
Because this has been going on for decades, and Indian removal is really, I feel like it's not a top-down policy imposed by the federal government as so much as a bottom-up policy where the people who live near the Indians demand that this happen, and the government has no other choice but ultimately to go along with it.
Yeah.
But guys like Jackson, who started off being the bottom-up people living on the frontier, win their way to power and then effectuate the policy.
They surely do.
And what the actual Indian Removal Act is it authorizes the president to negotiate treaties with the tribes to trade their land east of the Mississippi for west of the Mississippi.
Yeah.
And within a few years, 4 of the 5 major southern tribes signed treaties.
Yeah, but
quote unquote,
it's just, it's all so sketchy. It's all so shady.
Yeah.
They who knows how these meetings went down, but I cannot see, nor can I bring myself to believe that any meeting that took place was meant to try and come to an equal agreement, to try and...
No. I mean, it's by its nature imposing a unfair choice on the Indians.
It's straight up threat from the get-go.
But 4 of the 5 major southern tribes did sign treaties, and they migrated west of the Mississippi, quote-unquote, voluntarily. Not voluntarily, but the Cherokees held out. In 1835, some Cherokees who were not representative of the tribe as a whole signed a treaty. Other Cherokees assassinated some of the guys who signed this treaty, but the U.S. enforced the treaty anyway, and it wasn't until Jackson left office, the 8th president, Martin Van Buren, ordered the army to forcibly remove the Cherokee. That was the Trail of Tears.
And a disgusting blot.
4,000 Cherokees died. And also thousands of Choctaws and Creeks had died on their quote-unquote more voluntary migrations.
Yeah, you're talking about half of the Seminoles refusing to leave as a result of this. And this is going to lead to the Second Seminole War of 1835 and 1842. 3,000 Seminoles would be killed, and 4,000 forcibly relocated. But really a dark period in American history, this whole thing, and it just gets sadder and sadder as we move on. This is just the initial volley. And even before this, there were some questionable things, but this is where it really gets just bloody awful.
Yeah, it really is a dark time in American history, but I think it would be a mistake to assume or think that this is somehow in any way like unique to America.
No, come on, because you know what's going on at the same time.
Like this stuff,
slavery is going on at the same time. Like it's just the nature of the white man.
Well, I think it's the nature of all people.
Mm.
You know, the United States has this; it has slavery, and basically,
I don't know. It seems like we found things upon the white man's ability to subjugate those in a position not as comfortable as himself.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely true. And then, you know, but all throughout history, all people are doing that to each other. It's just this is the time when white people are ascending and doing it to others.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the Indian tribes were at war with each other.
Well, I know, like the English Empire. You know,
all throughout history.
And what they did in India and everything, you know.
I wanted to read a quote from Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is about the Belgian colonization of the Congo, which is a massive, virtually enslaving an entire country of people. 10 million people or more may have died in it. Yeah. This is from Heart of Darkness. This is from the beginning, where the narrator is talking about the ancient Romans going and colonizing and taking over Britain for the first time, which was at that time a remote island of what the Romans considered to be savage barbarians. And this is Heart of Darkness. Quote, "They were conquerors, and for that you only want brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it. Not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to." So that's what the American idea, you know, is up against.
Yeah.
That's what its cost is in blood.
Yeah.
And America has lots of great ideals and lots of things worth preserving, and that was the price of setting them up.
I don't know that I like those words particularly. I think I could, you know, I understand where he was coming from, given the context of the times, but I find it to be disagreeable. Well, we've been through it before, and we'll go through it again, listeners. Another hard topic in the podcast. So, perhaps we think on it, learn from it, and try and move on. With the bank recharter veto of 1832.
Yep.
So, the charter of the Second Bank of the United States was set to expire in 1836. In 1832, Congress passed a bill to recharter it, and Jackson vetoed it. He opposed the bank because he believed it was unconstitutional under the original Madisonian argument that Madison later abandoned and the Supreme Court rejected when it upheld the bank's constitutionality in McCulloch v. Maryland. But Jackson also opposed the bank on political grounds and felt it was the embodiment of the privileged elite enriching themselves at the expense of the common man.
Yeah, this is another big political veto by Jackson to kill the Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States, which was rechartered after the War of 1812, after Republicans let the First Bank of the United States expire. The Second Bank was poorly managed.
Right from the get-go.
At its outset, it contributed to the Panic of 1819. But, because, they started the bank and they put a lot of kind of Republican political guys in charge of it who weren't necessarily good bankers and didn't manage it skillfully.
Yeah, they weren't exactly the party of fiscal responsibility.
No, but by Jackson's time, the bank was under the leadership of Nicholas Biddle, and it actually was pretty well managed, at least in terms of its role in, promoting growth and stability in the national economy. But Biddle was also among those guys who hated Jackson, and he believed he could beat Jackson politically by forcing through the bank recharter that he thought Jackson wouldn't dare to veto in a presidential election year. But kind of, in a way, Biddle's activism in pushing for the recharter reinforced Jackson's view that the bank was not just a disinterested financial institution, but an engine of political corruption. It's kind of a catch-22. Jackson wants to kill the bank, and if the bank tries to defend itself politically, then it reinforces Jackson's view that the bank is political.
Exactly.
And so Jackson told Van Buren, quote, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I shall kill it."
And he calls Biddle's bluff. He vetoes the recharter. Many elites are shocked at the lack of outrage among the population, which soon reelected Jackson by an overwhelming margin.
Yeah, the bank defenders found out that the people don't care about the bank as much as they do.
Yeah.
And Jackson politically got away with this. This is another one of his, political vetoes. He vetoes something, he just flat out disagrees with it.
Kind of an eye-opener.
And because he has the people on his side, he gets away with it. And that becomes, one of the major defining features of the presidency forever, is that if the president has the people on his side, he can do almost anything he wants.
Yeah.
And Jackson's the first person to really start doing that.
That is pretty much it.
But the bank's, its recharter is ended, but it still has 4 years left. And Jackson, it's still going to be around for Jackson to feud with throughout his presidency.
Yeah. This isn't over.
Jackson won the first round.
Yeah. The battle has been won, but the war will continue. And speaking of war,
yep,
we could have had one.
Came to the brink of one right after Jackson was reelected in November 1832.
Yeah. We have a pretty huge crisis. It's the nullification crisis. Winter. I'm sorry, I should Sophia Petrillo. Picture it. Winter. 1832-33, following Andrew Jackson's re-election as president. And he's about to face off against the biggest crisis of his presidency.
Yeah, maybe the biggest crisis of the country up until this time.
That's a distinct possibility. I think it could be argued.
This particular crisis had been brewing since the Tariff of 1828, the so-called Tariff of Abominations, which Southerners hated because it protected Northern manufacturing interests at the expense of the South, increased prices for goods that Southerners needed to buy, and it depressed the price of cotton. Some Southerners argued that the tariff cost them 40% of their wealth.
That's a chunk.
They hate, you can't underestimate how much they hate this.
Right. Yeah, it can't be overstated how much they hate this.
Yeah. It becomes a major sectional crisis because the Southerners think it's unfair for the central government to be favoring one region so much over another, and it's a major states' rights issue. So the South Carolinians, who are led by Vice President John C. Calhoun, Jackson's own vice president, they revived the doctrine of nullification, which was originally espoused by Jefferson and Madison during the Sedition Act of the John Adams presidency.
Right.
When
You'll remember that from episode 2, listeners.
They asserted a state's right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. But the way Calhoun saw it, his view was that if a state decided to nullify a federal law as being unconstitutional, the onus would then be on the supporters of that law to pass a constitutional amendment, making it explicitly constitutional.
So this is absurd and pretty much directly contrary to the Constitution.
Yeah, it just turns everything on its head. In reality, it would be Calhoun believing the tariff to be unconstitutional should have to pass an amendment to the Constitution saying as much.
Yeah.
And the thing is, nobody really thought a tariff was unconstitutional per se. Everyone, I think, agrees that tariffs are allowed. And I don't know really the details of the theory, but at some point, a tariff becomes so unfair that it's unconstitutional.
I suppose
It's really just about power. And the Southerners just hate this so much that they're going to throw everything they got at killing it.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it's, a correct constitutional argument or not.
Right.
And they also see this as being a preemptive strike to protect slavery against the federal government. Some Southerners think that, hey, if the federal government can be forced to back down about this tariff, then it can never be powerful enough to come after slavery.
Yeah.
It will establish like a states' rights precedent that will protect slavery.
This is going to bring us to a famous dinner.
Yeah, a few years before the crisis breaks out, the battle lines were drawn at the 1830.
Yeah, the lines had been drawn in the sand, and the gauntlet was about to be thrown before the people. And it brings us to a dinner that took place, the annual Thomas Jefferson dinner, in 1830.
Yeah, Jackson saw that the list of attendees for this dinner were going to be mostly nullification supporters. So he showed up and gave a legendary toast. When it was his turn to toast, he stood up and said, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." And then it was on Calhoun gave the responsive toast, "The union next to our liberty, the most dear." So
That's it.
Those are the lines in the sand.
Yeah.
Jackson says the union is the top thing, and Calhoun hedges that the union is second to liberty, which will be in the eye of the beholder.
That's it. So that's going to bring us to 1832, where Jackson signs a revised tariff that slightly reduced the rates of the 1828 tariff, but South Carolina was not satisfied. And in November 1832, it passed a nullification ordinance purporting to declare the tariffs of 28 and 32 unconstitutional and unenforceable in South Carolina. So we got a major crisis on our hands.
Yeah, South Carolina is saying federal law is void and we're not going to follow it.
Right.
And this is a huge crisis because the other southern states also hate the tariff. and want it gone, but they're maybe a little bit more on the fence about nullification and the potential to break the Union.
Yeah. And if other states follow South Carolina's suit, it could mean civil war.
Yeah, this is about
outright
29 years prior to the Civil War,
Yeah.
like a preview of exactly how it breaks out.
Yep.
And so it's up to President Jackson to try to stop this from happening. So, it's a very delicate situation for him to handle. And he responded mildly at first. He had a State of the Union address coming up, and he called for moderation and good sense on all sides. But only a week later, he issued a stark proclamation to the people of South Carolina denouncing nullification as incompatible with the existence of the Union. Mm. So after he, said, hey, let's all get along. Also, if you don't.
Yeah.
He said he intended to enforce federal law and collect the tariff revenues in South Carolina, and anyone who resisted did so at their own peril. Quote, disunion by armed force is treason. Are you really ready to incur its guilt? If you are, on the heads of the instigators of the act be the dreadful consequences. On their heads be the dishonor, but on yours may fall the punishment.
Oof.
Jackson is coming out strong.
Yeah, he's serious.
And anyone who's threatening...
And not to be fucked with.
Jackson is working behind the scenes at this time to try to reduce the tariff and kind of, take the air out of the underlying issue here. But at the same time, he seeks congressional authorization to use force to enforce revenue collection in South Carolina. And the president already had kind of a general authority to use force to enforce the laws, but Jackson wanted Congress to authorize it in this particular instance.
Right.
So that he would have, the mandate to do this. And Jackson, he had armaments ready to go. He's getting the military ready, had agents reconnoitering the strength of the opposition in Charleston, South Carolina. Because the fear was that the nullifiers would seize the federal forts in Charleston Harbor, which, spoiler alert, is exactly how the Civil War began 29 years later. And, ultimately, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, shepherded the compromise through Congress, where they authorized the use of force, but also passed a new tariff that lowered rates. And that's
going to avert the crisis.
That averted the crisis. South Carolina took a parting shot by nullifying the use of force bill. Making sure they get the last word.
Cheeky.
But Jackson, his forceful leadership saved the Union.
Yeah, for the time being.
Because a weaker president, as you will see in episode 15, James Buchanan did not follow the Jackson model and meekly did nothing while the South
oddly enough, the last
secession.
True Jacksonian Democrat does not adhere to the Jacksonian principles and ends in dismal failure.
Yeah, because, Jackson... he's a Westerner, but he's also, he's a Southerner, he's a slave owner. He's probably not, he doesn't love this tariff personally. I think he supported some of the tariff to get support for himself from the North, but the high tariff isn't his baby. And he also doesn't want slavery threatened, but even though he maybe should be more sympathetic to the Southern interest in this issue he holds the Union as the preeminent thing.
That's right. He does. And when Abraham Lincoln sat down to write his first inaugural address, one of the few sources he consulted is Jackson's proclamation against nullification.
Yeah, this was a big, precedent that secession is not allowed, that the federal government can enforce its laws by force, and that union is preeminent over everything else. And that was ultimately the sin of John C. Calhoun and his friends in this is that they were willing to break the union, or they ultimately weren't willing to break the union over it.
Yeah.
And having to go that far made them look bad to a lot of people.
Indeed.
But this doesn't go away, obviously, and the same playbook will be replayed again later with a different president at the helm.
That's true. And speaking of replays, the bank's back. We're talking about the bank deposits removal, 1834. This bank just won't go away. What's going on now?
Well, Jackson vetoed the first attempt to recharter it, but it's still alive and still wants another recharter bill. And Jackson, a fervent believer in the corruption of the bank, thinks that if it is allowed to continue unattacked, that it will be able to buy up enough influence in Congress to recharter itself over his veto. So he wants to cripple the bank by removing federal deposits from the bank. So now, if it doesn't have the federal money to throw around, then it won't be powerful enough to buy its recharter, is right. Jackson's view.
And his solution is to put this money into state banks.
Yeah, he's going to pull the federal money out of the Bank of the United States and put it in state banks. And
now this seems like, all right, his idea, we're going to curb corruption. But Nicholas Biddle, he's not looking at it the same way, and he's not going to take Jackson's move lying down.
No, he's not going to let the bank go down without a fight. So he decides to stockpile the bank's reserves and contract credit, increasing interest rates and basically threatening a financial panic on the view that this will make Congress desperate to save the bank and will force Jackson to compromise on the bank.
A risky maneuver.
Yeah. And once again, Biddle misjudged Jackson, who never backs down.
Yeah,
and again,
he takes that gamble.
Yeah, underestimated the extent, again, that he had the people on his side here. By law, it's the Treasury Secretary that determines where to keep the federal deposits. And when Jackson's new Treasury Secretary wouldn't go along with this policy, he fired him and replaced him with the loyal Attorney General Roger Taney.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I've heard it Taney and I've heard it Tawny.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
But he would eventually become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And be pretty integral for quite a while in Jacksonian politics.
Yeah. But right now, he loyally removes the deposits, and Congress can't do anything. Some, Jackson's friends were like, hey, they might try to impeach you over this, and he says, bring it on.
Yeah.
Basically betting that they don't have the votes, and they didn't. If they could have had enough votes to impeach him, they could have just overrode his veto. So again, he has the people on his side. Really.
Right. But as a result, the Senate decides to do something remarkable and unprecedented in presidential history. They vote to censure Jackson. A symbolic condemnation that it doesn't really have an actual effect, but Jackson himself was the type of person, and absolutely anybody in that situation probably would be upset, but he was personally insulted and he was angry. His ire was raised. And with Jackson,
yeah, this
is a mistake.
Yeah. Well, this is just the way they could give him a thumb in the eye. They can't impeach him, but they can just do this to him instead. But he's not going to forget about it.
No, he's not.
So Jackson, he's riding pretty high. He killed the bank. He won the nullification crisis. He got reelected big. He's getting a lot of stuff done. The economy was booming, and revenues from public land sales enabled Jackson to fully pay off the national debt on January 1st, 1835.
A historical first and only.
Yep, the only time the national debt was ever paid off. But that kind of coincided with the boom coming to an end.
Yeah.
There was a Western land speculation bubble. Jackson tried to rein it in a bit with the 1836 specie circular requiring land to be paid for in gold and silver. But this, kind of just precipitated the bursting of the bubble.
That's it. And it's been hinted at since the beginning of the episode, really. Even back at the time of Jackson's birth, people were thinking there's a future in the West.
Oh, yeah. Western land speculation was the biggest thing.
And at this,
for decades. And it still would be again. This was just, a hiccup in the century of Western land speculation. So, in a way, it's probably an inevitable outcome of, a cyclical economy. But also, Jackson killing the bank didn't help.
Right.
And it's
one thing to kill the bank, but to not really have a solid replacement for it is a problem. And there wasn't a truly solid replacement. It was, let's divert things to the state banks.
Yeah, and the state banks were not necessarily super responsible.
Exactly.
With the money.
They weren't capable of the task at hand.
Yeah.
And so that's a serious problem, and it's going to lead to the Panic of 1837, which wouldn't hit until Martin Van Buren's presidency. And
Van Buren
he would end up taking a lot of the blame for it. Is that fair?
Well, probably not. It's probably not fair to blame him. Also, probably not fair to blame Jackson fully.
Exactly. It's kind of the Great Depression thing. Can you blame Coolidge? Can you blame Hoover? No. Not really. On that note, we're going to go into French indemnity. Talking 1834, 1835. But we're going to dip back to 1831.
Not a lot of big major foreign policy issues in Jackson's presidency.
And that's it. What was going on in the wild?
We're in the post-Napoleonic Wars era. Not as critical of an area in the United States at this time, but the one issue was with France. In 1831, the U.S. had signed a treaty with France whereby France was to pay $5 million in compensation for damages that the French Navy had inflicted on U.S. trade way back during the Napoleonic Wars. And in 1834, France was late on its payment, and its legislature voted not to make the payment, which Jackson took as a personal insult to America's honor.
Yeah.
A national insult.
Jackson takes a lot of personal insult.
He takes it personal and makes it personal.
That's pretty much it. That seems to be just the nature of his character.
So
we've seen it before, and we'll see it again.
He doesn't shy from any fight.
Certainly not.
He lambasted the French in his 1834 State of the Union for not honoring their word, and the French were insulted by Jackson, demanded that he apologize before they consider making the payment.
Jackson
seemed
looks
like an
at this,
apologetic guy.
And he says to himself, okay. So in his 1835 State of the Union, Jackson refused to apologize, but said he had a good opinion of the French and his intentions were peaceful. He also requested naval funding to prepare for potential war.
He says he wants peace while he prepares for war.
That's it. Who steps in to mediate? The British.
Yeah, the British
for the king. For the peace of the kingdom.
The British don't want another war breaking out. So they go and mediate. They convince the French to accept Jackson's previously expressed good opinion as an apology, and the payment was made. But there's Jackson not shying down from even a foreign war against a major world power.
No.
He goes up, he engages in a lot of brinksmanship and wins.
Yeah. And speaking of winning, Jackson would win out against death multiple times. We've already seen it.
Yeah.
And we're going to see it again. And you certainly recall from episode 4's top 5 failed presidential assassins. Number 3, Richard Lawrence tried to kill Andrew Jackson in 1835, approaching him after a funeral in the Capitol and firing 2 pistols at him, both of which misfired. Jackson, of course, going after him with his cane until others subdued the would-be assassin. Lawrence turned out to be a stone-cold nut job who believed that he was the rightful king of England. But what we didn't mention in episode 4 was that some of Jackson's friends suspected that Lawrence was hired by Jackson's enemies.
Yeah, some people think this is the first assassination attempt.
Yeah, this is some serious shit.
That this is a paid...
Somebody tried to kill the president of the United States for the first time.
Lots of people really hate Jackson. Who could be behind this? Jackson believed that behind this assassination attempt was Mississippi Senator George Poindexter, a huge Jackson hater, supporter of the bank and nullification. Just so happens that Poindexter's Washington, D.C. home had been painted by house painter Richard Lawrence.
Boom, boom, boom.
And so Jackson and his friends just make wild accusations
that
this senator is behind this assassination attempt. And Poindexter angrily demanded an investigation. Senate Select Committee looked into it and found no evidence. I think there was Jackson's people put up 2 witnesses. One was some guy who Poindexter owed a bunch of money to, I think, and some other guy who was a known drunkard.
Oh,
so they
boy.
put up these real flimsy witnesses. And it was,
and despite that,
it was determined
Poindexter would fail to win re-election later.
He was
cleared. Ruined him.
And there's nothing to these accusations, but he loses his re-election.
Yeah, that is a shame.
The following year. That's just another indication of the power that Jackson had, that he could just throw around a wild accusation and end a senator's career.
Yeah, he really did. We also have, wrapping up Jackson's presidency at this point, we have abolitionist mailings. 1835. Northern abolitionists begin mailing out anti-slavery pamphlets in the South. Now, Southerners claim that this threatens to provoke a slave insurrection, and they demand that the Postal Service ban the mailings. Jackson disliked the abolitionists. He believed that they were fomenting sectional discord that would eventually lead to the destruction of the Union. So he quietly allows Postmaster General Amos Kendall to give Southern postmasters discretion on the distribution of quote-unquote incendiary materials, and the mailings are suppressed. So
yeah, here's Jackson.
This is a problem for me, because this is suppression of free speech, and it's not to mention that they're on the wrong side of history.
Yeah, they're certainly on the wrong side of history. And I guess the legal technicality dodge here would be that something that actually literally calls for a slave insurrection probably would be incendiary and not free speech, at least under the assumption that slavery is legal.
Well,
so they just give...
But who actually wrote it? Somebody trying to stir shit.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is that Jackson, by giving Southern postmasters discretion to decide what's incendiary or not, he ensures that nothing that the Southerners don't want will get published.
Well, I think that's my overall point is, like, the people that probably wrote the quote-unquote incendiary material were white.
Yeah.
And
the people reading it were probably white
were
also.
white.
So they're
the
really...
only people who didn't have a say in any of it were the people of color who it affected.
Yeah, who were probably not taught to read, and I don't know if it's by this time that it's illegal to teach them. Not only that,
they were probably completely unaware of most of this, and it's like, oh well, So like the fact that somebody would propose an insurrection when 99.7% of slaves would have been totally ignorant to it.
Yeah. Well, that just goes to show how touchy Southerners are about slave insurrection. They can't let even a whiff of it. They're terrified by the prospect of slave insurrection for, decades.
Yeah, because they know that, they'll be outmatched.
Yeah.
They can't ball.
Yeah, ultimately
Can't ball?
There never really were many large slave insurrections in the U.S., but
no,
part of that is how hyper-vigilant they were against it.
I'm not going to necessarily call this a teaser, but potentially we're going to have, we're not just going to give up when we get through the presidents here. This is going to be an ongoing podcast, and we're going to cover a lot of historical figures and topics, and one of the ones that I was most interested in potentially covering in the future is one on slave rebellions, Nat Turner, folks like that. It's a whole nother chapter, and certainly an unpleasant one.
And during Jackson's presidency, the suppression of the mailings is not really about slave insurrection so much as it's just wanting to shut down any debate at all.
Exactly.
Which
they're trying to put a lid on the whole thing. In Jackson's presidency, the gag rule, I believe, is imposed. If it's not him, it's Van Buren, but I thought it was Jackson. I could be wrong, but I know the gag rule's coming into play real soon. Yeah, maybe this is the catalyst for it, and then under Van Buren, it gets
added to Congress.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that with John Quincy Adams' post-presidential congressional career.
Because he was vehemently against it.
By this time, John Quincy Adams was crushed for re-election by Jackson, but by now he's in Congress
making a comeback, baby.
Forming the part of the anti-Jackson party.
Yeah.
Another one of Jackson's big late acts as president, 1836, Chief Justice John Marshall died after 35 years leading the Supreme Court.
Yeah, John Marshall, a monumental figure, has passed away.
And this provides a big opportunity for Jackson to shape the court. He, as we mentioned, put Roger Taney, his loyal surrogate, as Attorney General and Treasury Secretary, as Chief Justice, where he served for 28 years. Did a lot of major work.
Yeah, there was a lot going on there. Most notably, you got Dred Scott v. Sanford.
Yeah, I don't know if Roger Taney, he may have done some good things on the Supreme Court, but he is most notorious for the 1857 Dred Scott case, where he ruled that Congress did not have the power to ban slavery in federal territories, which voided the Missouri Compromise. He also held that even free black people were not citizens. He called black people, quote, beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect.
So a real piece of shit, but he'd be a pretty central figure in Jacksonian democracy. I mean, he was one of those Supreme Court justices that is installed with the knowledge that this is going to help the party.
Yeah,
this is for the party.
Yeah, after...
Was it for the people? Sincerely.
John Marshall, held on to power.
John Marshall was like the last beacon of the original Federalist Party.
He kept the Federalist Party going in the court for
and that's why he was such a good
years after it was dead politically.
Chief Justice, was because, basically by the time of the end of his tenure, he was an objective, probably looked on by some as being like outdated in his political beliefs, but he focused on the law.
Yeah. And now
His political beliefs were nobody's business. That's what was necessary. Roger Taney was clearly a Jacksonian Democrat and was never even close to hiding it.
Yeah. Well, Dred Scott, probably the most ignominious decision in Supreme Court history.
Yeah.
Undermined the court's reputation for years, although, Taney's tenure very influential for Jacksonian principles in general.
Yeah.
For many years.
That's for sure. And hey, whatever happened to that censure? Jackson being censured by the Senate. My God, what a blight on the presidency. Holy shit.
Well, you'd think Jackson might just, he won, right? He can just let it go. No, during Jackson's final months in office, he could have surveyed the political landscape, seeing that over the past 8 years, all of his enemies had been laid to waste. He stood on the brink of retirement as perhaps the most powerful and successful president the nation had yet seen.
Yeah, I mean, it could be argued. I mean, people are going to say Washington, but Jackson, in the eyes of many, is a close second.
In terms of, just asserting power and getting done what he wants to do, winning the political battles he fights. His chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, is about to replace him. The two-party system that had collapsed after the War of 1812 is reborn in Jackson's image, really. Yeah. Those who supported Jackson were Democrats. Those who opposed him organized their own party, named it after the classic British opposition party, the Whigs. Jackson remade the presidency and American politics. But he had one last thing sticking in his craw, that old censure over his removal of bank deposits. He doesn't let it go.
No.
And in January 1837, in his final months, there's now a more favorable Jacksonian majority in the Senate. And over the objections of those who argued that the Constitution requires the Senate to keep a journal of its proceedings, the Senate voted to expunge Jackson's censure from the record.
Yeah. Expunge.
Like it never happened.
Yeah.
The symbolic
it's completely
disapproval
clean
is
slate.
Symbolically wiped away.
Yeah.
And the senator who led the expungement effort was none other than Thomas Hart Benton, who as a young man had engaged in a gunfight with Andrew Jackson.
As you'll remember.
Now, one of his biggest supporters. They made up before Jackson became president, and just another instance of Jackson triumphing over everyone who opposes him.
Yeah.
And with the censure gone.
Benton has become one of his biggest supporters at this point. And Jackson's political triumph seems to be complete.
Yep.
He can now retire to the Hermitage and enforce his influence from there.
Yep, we'll talk about the remainder of Jackson's life and sum it up right after this word from our sponsors.
Thanks again for listening.
Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Captain J.D. Smith, who publishes this important notice. Attention, town militia! You are hereby commanded to appear on the 7th of October at 8 o'clock a.m. in the Presbyterian Churchyard, armed and equipped as the law directs for review, by order of Captain J.D. Smith. Listeners, you heard the man. Get that old smoothbore musket out of the closet. Make sure your powder horn is full and sharpen your bayonet.
That's
because
right.
It's time for the semi-annual Town Militia Review. You never know which European imperialist power might be inciting the local Indian tribes to go on the warpath.
You never know.
So you gotta be ready for anything.
That's it.
As we all know, Captain Smith is a bit of a stickler, and he expects our company to be in shipshape and Bristol fashion, so let's not let him down. That's a message from our sponsor, Captain Smith.
And now, a very important message. Wet nurse wanted. A lady unable to nurse her own child wishes to find a respectable situation for it in some family in the hands of a mother who may have lost her own and wants another to nurse. Such cases sometimes occur. An application sent to the Dead President's podcast will be immediately attended to. To our listeners, are you a mother who just lost her newborn baby to a tragic death? Have we got an opportunity for you? Wipe away those tears and hit us up on Twitter at DeadPresPodcast, and we can hook you up with a job as a wet nurse to our latest sponsor. We know this must be a tough time for you, but there is finally a break in the clouds. The silver lining to your infant's premature demise is that it frees you up for this lucrative position. Don't wallow in sorrow and let those huge lactating breasts go to waste. Parlay them into straight cash by becoming a wet nurse, courtesy of the Dead President's Podcast.
Now an important message from our sponsor, Henry Kreis. Stray mare. Straight away out of the pasture field of Henry Kreis on the night of Monday the 26th, a small bay mare with a black mane and legs, low in carriage, about 10 years old. Whoever gives any information respecting said mare or delivers her to the owner will be handsomely rewarded. Listeners, be on the lookout for Henry Kreis's bay mare, and if you spot her, that reward could be yours. If I might venture a guess as to the whereabouts of this mare, I'd advise Henry Kreis to think like a mare and ask himself where on earth would a mare most like to be if she had her heart's choice. My guess is this mare has taken the shortest road to the stables that house Cock of the Rock.
That was my suspicion too, James.
Listeners, if you have any information that could lead to the recovery of Henry Kreis's mare, hit us up on Twitter at DeadPresPodcast, where you can learn more about our sponsors and see their original ads published in newspapers during Andrew Jackson's presidency.
And now, back to the show. And we're back, ready to talk about the post-presidency of Andrew Jackson. He would live for 8 years after his presidency, retiring to his beloved plantation, the Hermitage. He would campaign in Tennessee for Van Buren's failed re-election bid in 1840, and he would promote the career of his protege, James K. Polk, Speaker of the House. Big-time Jacksonian Democrat. I mean, this guy... This man, they called him Young Hickory.
Yep, he's carrying on the Jackson legacy.
He seems to be a not necessarily a successor, but a banner figure for the future.
Polk won the presidency in 1844.
And one of the big issues there, the annexation of Texas, which Jackson lobbied for, and which Polk finalized with a little help from Jackson's nephew, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, who served as a U.S. envoy to Texas. Jackson would die June 8th, 1845, at the age of 78, from heart failure and dropsy. He was mourned by his friends and supporters, but no one was more upset than his parrot Paul, who was escorted out of the funeral swearing like a motherfucker.
It was sad to see Jackson go.
That's true. Jackson's last words, I might not get it 100% correct. I'm doing it based off memory, but his last words were gathered to those gathered around him at his deathbed, who were weeping, and he said, "My children, do not cry. We shall all meet again in heaven." One, I call bullshit. And two, heaven. Take that any way you like.
Yeah, who knows where all those kids would end up.
Right. Speaking of kids, I guess we should have brought up, we didn't, during Jackson's early career, during a battle against some Native Americans, pretty much everybody was slaughtered, and they found a baby that had lived. Jackson decided to adopt him. He died eventually, in childhood, but interesting.
Yeah, Jackson's men, slaughter a bunch of Indians in battle, and he finds this little baby who is an orphan in a perverse way, reminding him of himself, who is orphaned by war.
Yeah, we really didn't talk about that. It's probably important to bring that up, the fact that he did that. I'm not defending him, saying that, oh, wow, what a noble act that he took this baby. And it's like, because, well, hey, I just slaughtered your parents, so I guess the least I could do is give you my name.
That just, goes to show how complex a person he is, how complex an issue that is.
Yeah.
The same guy who will, inflict a defeat, will then adopt a baby, will then, execute the Indian removal policy.
Yeah. I mean, anything else on Jackson, a summation of his character, of his being, of what he was like as a man. I don't think we really touched upon his character and his personality as we've tried to delve into with previous presidents. So in summation, let's try and delve into Andrew Jackson, the man, his personality. I mean, we know that he was a pretty tormented person.
Yeah, he'd been through a lot of turmoil and loss and hardship and physical pain and suffering and a lot of adversity. I would argue that he was certainly mentally affected by his upbringing, his youth. Yeah, all that loss, all that tragedy. He's just kind of like a battle-scarred person.
He was a lump of scar tissue, really. That made and the scar tissue became so hard that it was harder than a old hickory tree.
Yeah, he was really just a fighter. I think that's his personality. He's just a fighter in every situation. He never backs down, no matter what it is. He did, some really great things, some very questionable things, but in all of them, he's just, plowing through with the force of his own willpower.
What do you think of his mental state? Seriously, Jackson's the first president, that we're going to talk about that, people have questioned, his mental state. And have wondered, was there something off upstairs with this guy?
I don't know. I mean, he was a very, fiery, passionate, and aggressive guy, but I think given the long stretch of time throughout his whole career where he was basically bulldozing all of his enemies and winning all these battles, there had to be there's definitely method
behind it.
In his madness, and he was very politically astute.
Certainly.
And he wasn't, the most formally educated guy, but he was certainly
he was really the first president that was basically uneducated.
Yeah. Probably other than, Washington, the only other president so far that wasn't very, very highly educated.
Yeah. Well, and even Washington probably had it. Well, he certainly had it better than Jackson, but
Yeah. Jackson kind of had a chip on his shoulder his whole life in a way.
yeah.
And just stood up to everybody and never, backed down, never took no for an answer.
And
Rubbed a lot of people the
recreationally,
wrong way.
he was active. I mean, he did all kinds of things. Jackson wouldn't have been a bad guy to hang out with, I guess.
Yeah, that's probably part of his political success. Is
Part of his political charm, his draw to the people, was like, it's like, oh, I would play cards with Andrew Jackson. I would have a drink with Andrew Jackson. I would go to a dance where Andrew Jackson was there.
Yeah, he was definitely, the political, archetype of the guy, us would later be known as like the guy you want to have a beer with.
Right.
That aspect of your personality being a political boon, and Jackson definitely had that.
Yeah, where Washington was popular, but I don't think many people thought that they could relate to him, that they could approach him. Jackson, people felt, because of his upbringing and his station early in life, people thought, well, if I really work hard, maybe I could do something with myself. And Andrew Jackson understands me. He understands what I'm going through because he's been through it. So he, in that sense, he was the man of the people in terms of a presidential candidate.
Yeah, I don't think we didn't mention it earlier. When he first took office at his inauguration, the crowd who wanted to see him so bad,
overwhelmed and mobbed the White House. He was nearly crushed to death.
Yeah, they tracked mud and ended up destroying the rugs and
people
furniture
stole
in the White House.
shit.
Thousands of dollars of damage.
It was a circus. It was a madhouse, and his opposition press really made a field day with that.
Yeah,
the people's inaugural.
They were so enthusiastic.
People
Jackson.
were overjoyed because they thought finally somebody that actually speaks for us.
And his enemies probably looked down their nose on these uncouth people mobbing the White House, but Jackson took those people's opinions and, with them at his back, crushed everyone who stood in his way.
Yeah.
All the people who looked down at him ended up being, piles of bones at his feet.
That's pretty much it. It says a lot about Andrew Jackson. Mm-hmm. And let's see what other people have said about Andrew Jackson in summation.
Yeah, there's lots of good quotes about him. We have here a few. John Quincy Adams described Andrew Jackson as, quote, a barbarian who could not write a sentence of grammar and could hardly spell his own name.
Ouch. Henry Clay called him ignorant, passionate, hypocritical, corrupt, and easily swayed by the base men who surround him. So those are some pretty harsh words.
Yeah. You also have Theodore Roosevelt, who looked back and said, quote, Jackson had many faults, but he was devotedly attached to the Union, and he had no thought of fear when it came to defending his country. With the exception of Washington and Lincoln, no man has left a deeper mark on American history. And though there is much in his career to condemn, yet all true lovers of America can unite in paying hearty respect to the memory of a man who was emphatically a true American, who served his country valiantly on the field of battle against a foreign foe, and who upheld with the most staunch devotion the cause of the great Federal Union.
Well, I think all true lovers of America can unite in potentially agreeing with that sentiment. That's pretty well put.
Yeah.
Admitting to the mistakes. And, even coming from TR, he had mistakes of his own. So, bearing that in mind, a pretty good quote.
We also have from the biography American Lion by historian John Meacham, pulled a quote from him. The tragedy of Jackson's life is that a man dedicated to freedom failed to see liberty as a universal, not a particular gift. The triumph of his life is that he held together a country whose experiment in liberty ultimately extended its protections and promises to all. Belatedly, it is true. But by saving the Union, Jackson kept the possibility of progress alive, a possibility that would have died had secession and separation carried the day.
And who knows that, but it could have.
So we also forgot to mention and talk about our trip to the Hermitage. Trips, plural. Twice we've been to the Hermitage, Jackson's home outside Nashville.
Definitely a place to go see if you're in the Nashville area.
Yeah, pretty cool. Also nearby the James K. Polk home in
Not too far removed
Columbia,
at all. Makes for
Tennessee.
a nice little dual stop.
You can hit up Old and Young Hickory
That's
at
right.
the same time.
Get that tandem in there. It's good for you.
Yeah. Yeah,
But yeah,
Jackson's...
the Hermitage was that's a pretty wild place because that was, it's a plantation.
Yeah.
Very impressive garden on a positive note.
Yeah,
I will
it's
say
a really nice garden.
It's a beautiful, beautiful garden and very well kept. And Jackson and his wife, Rachel, are buried there.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. I think it also has the smaller, earlier, cabin type home that was the first home that Jackson built when he moved there.
Yeah.
And then obviously replaced it with a big shot mansion once he became a big shot.
Yeah, and the tapestries, wallpaper in there is fantastic.
Yeah, the main, entrance hall has, a big, landscape painting as its wallpaper. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah, and I think they said that it had been, partially damaged by a fire at some point, and then they had to, it was, a ludicrously expensive and complicated project to have it replicated exactly.
Yeah, I think
to fit the damaged parts.
A big portion of the Hermitage house burned while Jackson was president, I think, while he was away in Washington. And he had to rebuild.
Hate to get that news.
No.
But yeah, actually at the Hermitage you can take a the tour. You get the audio headset.
Yeah.
Because there's just so much to it that they couldn't do it in a guided tour. Now they do guided tours for the slave life at the Hermitage.
Yeah.
And we unfortunately we didn't have time to do that. We took the personal tours and spent a lot of time going around to hundreds of places. And you'd queue up the number on your little thing and it would tell you all about it. It's definitely a several hour event to go there and take the tour through the house and go through the grounds and their little museum and stuff. And I remember I bashed the hell out of my head on the rafter at one of the slave quarters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really hurt myself, and I felt I deserved it just because I'm white.
Yeah.
So, there's that.
Yeah, you can check that out if you are interested in Jackson. There's many great books about him that you can check out.
Yeah, obviously, most highly recommended if you're going to be a serious Jackson scholar is the Robert Remini 3-volume magnum opus Life of Andrew Jackson. I do believe that there is an abridged version in one volume that he did, but I can't remember what he called it. Sorry.
Yeah.
But if you want to get this guy knows Andrew Jackson as well as Andrew Jackson knew Andrew Jackson, pretty much. If you want to talk about presidential historians that are super, super into their subject in their times, Robert Remini in addition to writing on Jackson, has written like the definitive works on Henry Clay, and just all kinds of subjects during that period.
Yeah, he had a book about the Compromise of 1850.
Yeah.
He also has another book specifically about the Battle of New Orleans.
Right, and I think he did one on Van Buren.
Probably.
But yeah, that's the number one. Check that out.
There's American Lion by John Meacham.
Right, more modern take.
We just quoted. That focuses mostly on Jackson's presidential years, and it's very good. H.W. Brands wrote a Jackson biography that I've read before that's pretty good. What else? There's a book called Hardened into Hickory by Tony Turnbow, I think. I think it's technically a self-published book, but it's all about the Natchez campaign where, you know, Jackson went down and had to turn around and march back when he gets his nickname, Old Hickory.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good book there.
I'm sure he'll appreciate the plug.
Yeah. And then there's there's the Remini book on the Battle of New Orleans, and also William C. Davis has a book about the Battle of New Orleans called The Greatest Fury, which is also very good.
Yeah, I do. I think I remember hearing about that one. I read something else that he wrote, but I can't remember what it was.
I think he wrote a book about Lee and Grant. He has a book about the Lafitte brothers piracy operation.
Anywho.
Lots of great biographers.
Yeah.
To check out.
Lots of good writers. And lots of different ways to sum up Andrew Jackson. And perhaps to best attempt to sum up Andrew Jackson is to basically not sum him up so much as to try to describe what he was. And James Parton, a Jackson biographer early on, summed him up thusly, and I think this is the best way to close our show and try to provide a summation of Andrew Jackson. Quote, Andrew Jackson, I am given to understand, was a patriot and a traitor. He was one of the greatest of generals, and wholly ignorant of the art of war. A writer brilliant, elegant, eloquent, and without being able to compose a correct sentence or spell words of 4 syllables. The first of statesmen, he never devised, he never framed a measure. He was the most candid of men, and was capable of the profoundest dissimulation. A most law-defying, law-obeying citizen. A stickler for discipline, he never hesitated to disobey his superior. A democratic aristocrat, an urbane savage, an atrocious saint.
Wow.
I think that's some pretty deep and pretty profound words on our nation's 7th president, and really, that hits the nail on the head.
Yeah.
Jackson was an odd mentality.
Yeah, he was a unique...
It is certainly a unique personality.
A unique president, certainly, of the way presidents had been up to his time.
Absolutely. I mean, this is
breaker.
the clear mark of a future in American politics. But is it? Or is it too much? How are the presidents following Jackson going to fare? Well, you're going to find out in our next couple episodes. This has been episode 7 of the Dead Presidents Podcast. Here is a little song by the Constitutionalists to end the episode. This is Andrew Jackson. Thanks for listening.
Arrives. Stop thinking and go in. The individual who refuses to defend his rights when called by his government deserves to be a slave and must be punished as an enemy of his country and friend to her foe. Can't think of at least 2 ways to spell any